Hello everyone, I'm the Creep's Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to go for a walk along a quiet country road I hadn't taken before. The day had been warm, but the air was beginning to cool, and a faint breeze moved through the tall grass on either side of the cracked asphalt. I'd been feeling restless all day, and I thought a long walk might help clear my head. The road was narrow, lined with overgrown weeds, and patches of gravel crunched under my shoes with every step. In the distance, there was a line of trees stretching across the horizon like a dark wall. The road seemed to lead straight into them. I didn't have a real destination in mind, but I liked the idea of seeing where the road ended. I had no reason to feel uneasy at first. Birds were still chirping, and the sky was open and pale, with a faint orange tint from the lowering sun. But the further I walked, the fewer signs of people there were. The occasional farmhouse I'd passed earlier had long since disappeared from view, replaced by wide, empty fields. I could see broken fence posts leaning at odd angles and rusted barbed wire tangled in the weeds. Eventually, the road began to slope downward slightly. The sound of my footsteps felt louder, sharper, like they were echoing off something unseen. I noticed how the wind had stopped, leaving the air still and heavy. It was strange how sudden the change was. The grass on both sides barely moved now, and the only sound was the dull scrape of gravel beneath my shoes. The tree line ahead seemed closer now, but the way the light was fading made it look almost black. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the road had turned into a rough dirt path. It was rutted in places, with shallow puddles of muddy water collected in the deeper grooves. I stepped around them carefully, not wanting to soak my shoes. The trees on either side were tall and dense, their branches forming a high canopy that blocked out much of the remaining daylight. The moment I stepped under them, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air smelled of damp leaves and old earth, like the forest floor had been wet for days. The path twisted deeper into the trees. I could hear faint rustling somewhere off to my right, maybe a small animal in the undergrowth, but I couldn't see anything through the thick brush. As I walked further, I started to notice subtle things. The path seemed less used here, with weeds growing in the middle of it, and the dirt was soft under my feet in some spots, almost spongy. There was no wind at all now, and the stillness had a weight to it, pressing in on my ears. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but the path behind me was already darker, swallowed by shadows. After a while, I realized I hadn't heard any birds since entering the woods. Not a single chirp or flutter of wings. The silence was unnatural, so complete that I could hear my own breathing clearly. My footsteps seemed too loud, too out of place. I slowed down without meaning to, my eyes scanning the trees for any movement. The path took a sharp curve to the left, and as I rounded it, I saw something ahead that made me stop completely. There was a shoe lying in the middle of the path. It was dirty and worn, the kind of thing you'd expect to see tossed aside in a city alley, not out here in the middle of nowhere. It looked like it had been there for a while. Dirt clung to the laces, and one side of the sole was peeling away. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker had lost it. Maybe someone had been walking through and didn't notice it fall. But the way it sat there, almost directly in the center of the path, felt deliberate somehow. I stepped around it and kept moving, but the unease in my stomach was growing heavier. I noticed my pace had quickened without me deciding to speed up. The path seemed narrower now, the undergrowth crowding closer, forcing me to brush against branches that left faint scratches on my arms. My eyes kept darting to the sides, scanning the shadows between the trunks, certain I was going to see something move. Not long after, I spotted something else. This time it was a dark-colored jacket hanging from a low branch just off the path. The sleeves dangled down, swaying slightly, even though there was no breeze. The fabric was damp and clung to the branch in places, as if it had been hanging there for a long time. My heart was pounding harder now. It was too much of a coincidence to find two abandoned items like that so close together. I told myself to turn back, but when I looked behind me, the path seemed darker than before. The shadows were thick and heavy, making it hard to see more than a few feet. I felt an instinctive resistance to the idea of walking back into that darkness. So I kept moving forward, even though I didn't know where this path led. My legs felt tense, ready to run at the first sign of movement. The next turn in the path brought me to a small clearing. The ground here was uneven, with patches of bare dirt and scattered leaves. On the far side of the clearing, there was an old wooden structure, what looked like the remains of a hunting blind or maybe a storage shed. The wood was gray and splintered, with several boards missing. Something about it felt wrong immediately. The air smelled faintly of something sour, like meat left out too long. I stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning the shadows inside the structure. It was too dark to see clearly, but I thought I could make out shapes, piles of something stacked against the far wall. I didn't want to get closer, but at the same time, I couldn't just turn away without knowing. Every step I took toward it felt heavier, my skin prickling like it knew I was doing something I shouldn't. When I finally reached the open doorway, the smell was stronger. My eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, and I saw what had been stacked inside. It wasn't just old wood or debris. There were bags, black trash bags, tied tightly at the top. Some were slumped over, others stacked on top of each other. A few had split open slightly, and from one of them, I saw something pale inside. I didn't want to think about what it was, but the shape was unmistakably organic. I backed away, my heart beat loud in my ears. I didn't want to turn my back on that shed, but I knew I had to leave. The stillness around me felt different now, heavier, almost watchful. I moved quickly back toward the path, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. My ears strained for any sound that didn't belong to me. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard a faint snap, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze, holding my breath. The sound didn't come again, but I didn't wait. I started moving faster, then faster still, until I was nearly jogging. The path seemed to stretch on longer than before, the turns unfamiliar, even though I knew I was retracing my steps. My chest ached from breathing too hard, but I didn't slow down. When I finally saw the pale light of the road ahead, I felt my muscles loosen slightly. I didn't stop until I was fully out of the trees and standing back on the cracked asphalt. The breeze had returned, cool against my face, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched from the darkness of the tree line. I walked quickly back the way I'd come, not looking over my shoulder again. By the time I saw the first farmhouse in the distance, my legs felt heavy and my throat was dry. I didn't stop moving until I reached my own door and locked it behind me. That night, I kept thinking about the shoe, the jacket, and those black bags in the shed. I knew I should call someone, tell them what I'd found, but part of me was afraid of what might happen if I drew attention to it, afraid of who might already know I'd been there. In the end, I stayed silent. But I haven't walked down that road again, and I never will. Because sometimes the woods don't need ghosts to be dangerous. Sometimes it's what's already living and hiding there that's worth fearing. And I know now, without a doubt, that someone else was in those trees with me that day. Someone who never made a sound. It started late in the afternoon, just before the light began to thin. The air had that heavy late summer feeling, still warm, but with a faint coolness slipping in, reminding me that night wasn't far. I had been walking along a narrow, barely used trail that cut through a stretch of woods about 10 miles from town. I'd been here before in daylight, but never stayed late, never stayed long enough to hear the forest change its tone when the sun went down. The trail was uneven, roots crossing in every direction. Dry leaves clung to my shoes, crunching under every step. On both sides, the trees rose close together, tall and thin, their branches tangling into a loose canopy that blocked out most of the sky. Patches of dim light slipped through the gaps, falling on the forest floor in broken shapes. The deeper I went, the less I could see the horizon. It felt like I'd stepped into a space where time slowed down, where the rest of the world was far behind me. The further in I went, the quieter it got. Even the occasional bird call began to fade until I was left with only the sound of my footsteps. I could feel the sweat starting to dry on my skin, the air cooling just enough to make the dampness uncomfortable. A light wind moved through, barely strong enough to rustle the leaves above, but it carried a faint smell of damp soil, wood, and something else, something sharp, like the tang of rust. I stopped once to take a drink from my bottle and noticed how still everything was. Not just quiet, but still, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I couldn't see the trail ahead clearly anymore. It had grown thinner, the dirt path narrowing and fading under a layer of leaves and twigs. I remembered there was an old stream somewhere deeper in, and I thought maybe I'd head toward it before turning back. As I walked, I began noticing small details that didn't feel right. A broken branch hanging lower than it should, as if it had been snapped recently. The way the dirt was disturbed in certain spots, almost like shallow drag marks. A section of moss scraped clean from a fallen log, as though something heavy had slid across it. It wasn't enough to raise full alarm, but enough to make me slow down, to keep scanning the shadows ahead. The light was dimming fast now, the colors shifting from golden to gray. The air cooled more noticeably, and the shadows thickened. I could feel the first traces of that familiar unease. Nothing I could explain, just a tightening in my chest and the growing urge to turn around. I kept walking, but slower, every step quieter, more deliberate. That was when I heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the wind. A single, soft sound from somewhere ahead and to the left. It wasn't an animal cry, not quite. It was more like the sound of something heavy shifting its weight on the forest floor, leaves crunching under slow, deliberate pressure. I froze, every muscle tensing, my ears straining. For a moment, nothing. Then another step, heavier this time. The sound wasn't rushing toward me or moving away. It was steady, slow, unhurried. My eyes scanned the space between the trees, but there was nothing clear, only shapes in the dim light. The wind picked up slightly, making the leaves flutter, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just a deer. But then I realized something was different. A deer would move lightly, in short bursts, pausing, darting. This was heavier, spaced evenly like a person walking. I couldn't see far enough ahead to know for sure, and my stomach tightened at the thought of someone else being this deep in the woods without me knowing it. I stepped off the trail slightly, pressing myself between two thick trunks, my feet sinking slightly into the damp layer of leaves and soil. The sound continued, coming from somewhere just beyond a line of brush. I could almost picture the shape of something tall moving slowly, but I couldn't make out any details. I held my breath without realizing it, my ears catching every crunch of leaves, every shift of weight. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed frozen, counting the seconds in my head. 10 seconds. 15. 20. I didn't move. My heart was beating hard enough to feel in my neck. Somewhere in that silence, a faint sound came from behind me. A different direction entirely. It was softer this time, like a careful step, and it came from much closer. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dim space between the trees, but again nothing. The shadows seemed thicker now, stretching longer as the last light drained from the sky. I felt the air shift slightly, a faint breeze on the back of my neck that shouldn't have been there. It made me move. I stepped back toward the trail, my feet crunching louder than I wanted them to. My pace quickened, and the urge to get back to where the trees thinned out became all I could think about. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, and every time I did, I swore I caught the faintest flicker of movement far behind me. A shape too tall to be a deer, too steady to be the wind. I didn't let myself slow down. My breathing grew shallow, and my body felt tense all over. The trail seemed longer now, the familiar markers I remembered from earlier nowhere in sight. The sounds began again, keeping pace with me, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see clearly. The crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the kind of sounds that matched my own movements almost too closely. My legs burned as I pushed myself faster, my eyes darting constantly to the sides and back. When the first sign of the treeline appeared ahead, just a faint thinning of the darkness, I felt a wave of relief push through the fear. I moved quicker, almost running now, but the sounds behind me matched the change. They grew faster, heavier, more certain. I broke into a full run, my breath ragged, my arms pumping. The trees began to thin, patches of pale sky appearing between them. I didn't dare look back now, didn't want to see what might be there. The ground felt uneven under my feet, roots catching at my shoes, but I pushed forward. When I finally burst out of the treeline into the open clearing near the road, I didn't stop. I kept moving until I was well out into the open, away from the shadows. Only then did I turn, my chest heaving, my eyes locked on the dark wall of trees I had just come from. Nothing moved. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting for some sign of what had been behind me. The forest looked calm again, quiet, as though nothing had happened. But deep down I knew it wasn't empty. Something had been there, keeping pace with me, watching me without a sound until it decided to move. Even as I walked away, back toward the road and the faint glow of distant streetlights, I kept looking over my shoulder. I could still feel the weight of eyes on me, the memory of footsteps that matched my own. That night, lying in bed, the sound of crunching leaves wouldn't leave my head. It was steady, slow, unhurried, the sound of something that had no reason to rush. Something that knew exactly where I was and exactly how far I could run before the trees ended. And in that dark, quiet space of my room, I realized I had no idea how long it had been following me. It could have started long before I ever heard it, long before I even thought to look behind me. It could have been there from the moment I stepped into the woods. I had been driving since early morning, trying to make it to my cousin's place before nightfall. The road cut through long stretches of farmland, occasional patches of forest, and small towns that felt almost abandoned. The air had been warm during the day, but as the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped, and a damp chill settled in. I was still about 2 hours away when I saw a small gas station on the side of the road. The sign above it was old, the paint fading, but I decided to stop and stretch my legs before continuing. The gas station was one of those lonely places with a single pump, a flickering overhead light, and a store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and old wood mixed together. I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, paid in cash, and stepped back outside. The air felt heavier now, with the last bits of daylight slipping away. I got back in my car and kept driving, watching the landscape flatten out, the fields stretching so far they seemed to meet the horizon. The two-lane road ahead of me wound slightly, and then straightened for long, empty stretches. I noticed how few cars passed by, maybe one every 20 minutes. After a while, the road narrowed, and dense woods replaced the open fields. The trees leaned over the road, their branches tangled like a net, making the fading light dim even faster. By the time I reached the midpoint of that wooded stretch, it was almost fully dark. My headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the blackness, and the beams bounced off trunks and low branches. The road was smooth at first, but then I hit a rough patch, the kind where the asphalt breaks up into jagged edges and gravel. I slowed down, feeling the crunch under my tires. That's when I saw something just ahead, what looked like a dark shape lying across part of the road. At first, I thought it might be a fallen branch, but as I got closer, I saw it was too big and too oddly shaped for that. I slowed more, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. It was an animal, a deer maybe, lying on its side. My headlights lit up its legs, twisted at angles that didn't seem right. Its chest rose and fell shallowly, meaning it was still alive. I stopped the car about 10 feet away. The deer's head lifted slightly, and I caught the reflection of its eyes for just a moment. But then, from the darkness beyond the trees, I heard something else, a faint crunch of leaves. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. My instinct told me to just drive around the deer, but the way it was lying made that impossible without going off the road. The noise in the trees stopped. I sat there, staring into the blackness between the trunks, waiting for something to move. My heart was pounding, and I could feel that prickly sensation in my skin that comes when your body is screaming that something isn't right. I rolled forward slightly, thinking maybe I could nudge the deer enough to pass. But just as I eased forward, there was another sound from the woods, a single, heavy footstep. Not the quick scurry of an animal. Slow, measured. I stopped again. My headlights caught brief flashes of something pale between the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but I knew it wasn't another deer. It stood still for a long moment, and then it moved, stepping deeper into the shadows. I didn't like the feeling in my stomach. I backed the car up, the tires crunching on gravel, then turned sharply and went off onto the narrow shoulder. The edge dropped off into weeds and underbrush, and my car tilted slightly as I maneuvered past the deer. As soon as I cleared it, I pressed on the gas and drove until the woods thinned and I reached an open stretch again. I kept glancing in my mirrors, expecting to see something step out into the road behind me, but there was nothing except the empty asphalt disappearing into darkness. About 10 minutes later, I noticed my gas gauge was lower than I thought it would be. That stop at the station earlier had been quick, and I'd only gotten enough to make it comfortably to my cousin's, but the detour around the deer had eaten up more fuel than I'd planned. I pulled over briefly to check my map, and saw there was a small town about 6 miles ahead. It wasn't much, but it had a gas station marked. When I got there, the place was dimly lit and completely deserted. The pump had an old analog meter and a faded sign saying it was self-serve, cash only. I filled the tank and stood there for a moment listening. The night air was so quiet it felt unnatural. No crickets, no wind through the trees, just silence. I got back in my car and drove on. The road out of that town curved back into more wooded areas, but this time the trees were thinner. I felt a little more at ease until I saw something up ahead again. Two small points of light reflecting back at me from the side of the road. They were low to the ground, probably an animal's eyes, I thought. As I got closer, the eyes vanished, and I caught a glimpse of movement as something darted into the underbrush. I drove past, trying not to focus on it too much. About half an hour later, I finally pulled onto the long rural driveway leading to my cousin's property. The driveway itself was lined with trees, their branches reaching high enough not to block the view of the sky. The house came into sight, lights glowing warmly in the windows. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd, a single fresh set of muddy footprints leading up the gravel drive, veering slightly into the grass, and then disappearing into the tree line to the right of the house. I slowed down again, staring at those tracks. They were human, barefoot. The ground was damp from an earlier drizzle, and the prints looked recent, the edges still crisp. They were spaced in a way that suggested the person wasn't running, but walking steadily. I stopped the car in front of the house and looked toward the trees, but the darkness there was thick, hiding everything beyond the first few feet. A faint unease crept back in, the same kind I'd felt back on the road with the deer. I sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to listen for anything. The night was still quiet, but that silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was holding its breath. I got my bags from the car quickly and went inside. My cousin wasn't home yet. He had mentioned earlier he might be late from work, but the house felt too still. I checked the locks twice, then went to the front window and peered out. The gravel driveway was empty, but I could just make out the faint outline of those footprints still pressed into the grass. For the rest of the night, I kept the lights on and stayed near the windows listening. Every so often, I thought I heard faint movements outside, a branch bending, leaves shifting, but it was too irregular to be the wind. I didn't sleep until I heard my cousin's car pull in sometime past midnight. The next morning, I went outside. The footprints were still there, but now there was something else. A second set. These were much fainter, as if whoever made them had been standing in one place for a while, right near the edge of the trees, just facing the house. And I knew, without wanting to admit it, that whoever had been out there on that road the night before had somehow made their way here. It had been a long week at work, and I needed to get out of the city. My head felt like it was in a constant hum from the noise of traffic, screens, and people talking over each other. I had no interest in going to a crowded place or a tourist spot. I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I wouldn't hear anything but the wind. I thought about a small lake I had seen once while driving through a rural area. The road that led to it was rough and narrow, barely more than a track, and it wound through thick woods until it reached an open clearing with water in the middle. I remembered thinking that it would be a perfect place to camp if I ever wanted to be alone. That Saturday, I threw my gear in the back of my car: tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with food, and some basic camping supplies. I didn't even bother telling anyone where I was going. I wanted to completely disappear for a night or two. The drive was long and slow. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and eventually to that uneven track. My tires crunched over rocks and dipped into ruts filled with muddy water. The trees on either side leaned in, blocking most of the light, so that even though it was mid-afternoon, the road ahead looked dim. When I finally reached the clearing, it felt exactly as I remembered, silent except for the faint sound of water lapping against the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves. The lake was calm, with the sunlight reflecting off it in a glare that made me squint. Tall grass grew along the edges, and there were no signs of other campers or even any human activity. I set up my tent about 30 feet from the water, just close enough to hear it at night. I spent the rest of the afternoon collecting small branches for a fire. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots sank a little with each step. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I walked around the edge of the lake for a while, just taking in the stillness. A few dragonflies hovered over the surface, and now and then I'd see the ripple of a fish breaking the water. The trees around the lake were dense, and beyond them, the forest looked almost black. There was something about those shadows that made me glance over my shoulder more than once, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to such complete quiet. By evening, I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal and sat watching the sky fade from pale blue to orange to deep purple. As darkness settled in, the lake turned almost mirror-like, reflecting the stars. The air cooled quickly, and the firelight became my only comfort against the surrounding blackness. I heard the occasional splash from the lake, but otherwise it was silent. Too silent, in a way. Even at night, I expected to hear insects, maybe a frog or two, but it was as if the forest was holding its breath. Around 9, I decided to take a short walk with my flashlight. I followed a narrow path that led into the trees, just to stretch my legs before turning in. The beam from my light cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of the trees and the occasional glint of moisture on leaves. I didn't go far, maybe 100 feet, before I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the sound of twigs snapping, somewhere deeper in the woods. I stood still listening. The sound came again, then stopped. I told myself it could be a deer. This was their territory, after all. But there was something about the rhythm of the steps that didn't feel like an animal's random movement. They were steady, deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing slowly. I stayed there for another minute, my flashlight aimed in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Eventually, I turned and went back to my camp. The unease stayed with me, though. When I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. The fabric walls of the tent felt too thin, too flimsy. Every sound outside seemed louder in the dark. I lay there, listening to the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, until I finally drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, and the inside of the tent was completely dark. At first, I thought it was just the quiet that woke me, but then I heard it, footsteps again. Slow, crunching in the grass. They were close. Too close. I held my breath and strained to hear. The steps circled around my tent, pausing every so often, as if whoever, or whatever, it was listening for something inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might be loud enough to give me away. Then the sound stopped. I lay there frozen for what felt like several minutes, afraid to move. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, there was another noise. Not footsteps this time, but the sound of something brushing against the tent wall, just inches from my head. The fabric shifted slightly inward, like a hand pressing on it. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. The pressure disappeared, and I heard the steps again, moving away this time, toward the water. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up with my back against my pack, flashlight in hand. I didn't hear anything else until the faint light of dawn started to seep through the tent walls. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was damp with dew, and there were footprints in the grass. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, barefoot, from the look of them. The prints led from the tree-line to my tent, circled it, and then went toward the lake. I followed them slowly, every nerve in my body tense. The prints went right to the edge of the water and stopped. I scanned the surface, but it was calm, as if nothing had disturbed it. The woods behind me were silent, but that silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something watching and waiting. I packed up quickly, barely taking the time to fold my tent. My hands shook as I shoved everything into the car. As I drove out, the narrow track seemed even darker than before, the trees crowding in on both sides. Every shadow between them looked like it could hide someone. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I realize how tense my shoulders had been, how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. There was never anyone there, but the feeling didn't go away. Even when I was miles from the lake, I felt it, that quiet, steady presence just out of sight. Later, when I thought about the footprints, I realized something that made my skin crawl all over again. The ground was soft, and I had left my own prints near the tent when I went for my evening walk. But the ones I'd seen in the morning were deeper, heavier, and they overlapped mine in places. Whoever had been there had been walking in my steps, following exactly where I had gone. That night, safe in my own bed, the silence of my apartment should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Every creak of the building, every faint sound from outside, felt sharper now, more deliberate. I kept thinking about that moment in the tent when the wall had pressed inward, about the weight of it, the stillness before it moved away. I didn't go camping again after that. Not alone. Not anywhere near a place where you can't tell if the quiet is just the woods being still, or if it's someone waiting for you to let your guard down. It was a little past 6 in the evening when I decided to take a walk. The air had cooled just enough after the day's heat, and the sky was beginning to soften into that dim orange haze before sunset. I had been restless all day, sitting at home doing nothing, and I figured a walk might help clear my head. I didn't have a set route in mind, just the thought of moving until the streetlights started flickering on. My neighborhood sat on the edge of a long, quiet road that eventually bled into the countryside, and I thought maybe I'd go far enough to see the open fields before turning back. As I walked, the sound of the city dulled. The hum of traffic faded into the background, replaced by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The road stretched ahead in long, slow curves, the street narrowing slightly with every step. Houses thinned out, replaced by tall weeds creeping up from neglected plots of land. I could feel the air shifting, less exhaust, more earth and grass. My steps felt lighter. I noticed the smell too, cleaner, sharper, a mix of soil and faintly damp wood. The light was fading faster than I expected. I kept thinking I'd go just a little further, but each bend in the road seemed to reveal another stretch that looked even more open, like the next curve might finally show me the fields in their entirety. My shoes crunched over small stones scattered across the road's shoulder. The only consistent sound was the rhythmic scuff of my steps and the faint whistle of wind through the tall grass. Eventually, I reached a point where the asphalt looked cracked, almost forgotten. On one side, a row of old wooden fence posts leaned at awkward angles, some half buried in the weeds. Beyond them was a field, wide, empty, with patches of brown dirt breaking through the grass. On the other side of the road stood a wall of trees, thick and dark, their branches tangled together in a way that made the inside seem much darker than the road itself. I paused, staring into that tree line. Even from where I stood, the air in there seemed different, cooler, heavier. The ground under the first few trees was bare, covered in a mat of dead leaves. It didn't look like a place people walk through often. I turned back toward the road, but something about the trees kept pulling my eyes. I couldn't explain why. It wasn't curiosity in the usual sense. It was more like a pull, a subtle pressure to just step closer. The wind picked up, and for a moment, the branches swayed and revealed a narrow opening between the trunks. It wasn't a clear path, more like a gap in the growth. I stepped toward it almost without thinking. The road behind me was still visible, but I could already feel how quiet it got with just a few steps under that canopy. The sounds of the outside world dulled, replaced by the low groan of wood shifting in the wind. The air smelled strongly of damp earth. The ground was uneven, soft in some spots, firm in others. I could hear twigs snapping under my shoes. A layer of thin fog clung to the forest floor in scattered patches, hugging the bases of the trees. I didn't go far, just enough to feel like I was somewhere entirely separate from the open road. My heart was beating faster, not in panic, but in a kind of heightened awareness. The stillness pressed against my skin. Every movement I made seemed too loud in comparison. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the shifting of branches. It was faint at first, almost like fabric dragging over the ground. I froze, my ears straining. The sound came again, slow, uneven, like something heavy being moved, then a pause, then another drag. I turned toward where it seemed to be coming from, deeper into the trees. I couldn't see far. The light was dim, and the spaces between trunks blurred into shadow. But I could hear it more clearly now. Drag. Pause. Drag. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer moving through undergrowth. But there was no rustling, no quick, sharp movement. Just that slow, deliberate sound. I realized my hands were clenched without meaning to. My mouth felt dry. The dragging stopped for a moment, and in that silence, I could hear something else, a faint, steady breathing. It was low, heavy, and it didn't sound far. I backed up a step, keeping my eyes on the dark patch between the trees where the sound had come from. The breathing grew quieter, like it was moving away. But as I shifted my weight to turn back toward the road, I caught a flash of movement, something pale against the dark. I didn't get a clear look, just the brief impression of a shape slipping behind one of the larger trunks. My skin prickled all over. I moved quickly then, keeping my steps as quiet as I could, retracing my way to the edge of the trees. The road looked brighter than it had before. The last streaks of daylight stretched thin across it. I stepped out and felt the air change instantly, lighter, easier to breathe. I walked faster, putting distance between myself and that opening. I didn't turn around. I made it back to the first streetlight before I slowed down. My pulse was still high, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my back. I glanced behind me. The bend in the road hid the opening to the trees now. I kept moving, telling myself I'd gone far enough for the day, that I'd stick to the busier streets next time. But the sound of that dragging stayed in my head all the way home, along with the faint image of that pale shape disappearing into the dark. Later that night, I lay in bed replaying it in my mind. I kept trying to think of ordinary explanations. Maybe it was a person moving something. Maybe it was an animal carrying something heavy. But each time I thought about that slow, steady breathing, my chest tightened. It wasn't the kind of sound that came from a creature startled or curious. It had a patience to it, like it didn't need to rush. The next day, I decided to avoid that stretch of road entirely. I didn't even want to see the field or the line of trees again. But as the days went by, the memory of it didn't fade. If anything, it became sharper, the details clearer. The smell of damp soil, the uneven ground under my feet, the cold shift in the air, the way the trees seemed to hold something just out of sight. I realized I had no idea how far that forest went or what was inside it. I didn't want to know. Weeks later, I heard from someone in the neighborhood that an old storage shed had been found deep in those woods, collapsed in on itself. They said there were signs that someone had been living there at some point. Food cans, blankets, a pile of clothes. No one knew for how long. They didn't say anything about finding anyone inside. I didn't ask questions. I didn't walk that way again. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is quiet enough, I swear I can still hear it. The slow drag, the pause, and that breathing, patient and steady, waiting for something to wander close again. It had been a long week at work, and I wanted to clear my head. Driving out of the city seemed like the best option. I didn't have a set plan, but I ended up following the highway into the countryside, then turning down smaller roads until I found myself surrounded by nothing but empty fields and patches of thick woodland. The air was cooler out there, the kind that carried a faint, earthy smell after a recent rain. I kept driving until I came across a narrow dirt road that cut through a dense line of trees. There was no sign or marker, just a break in the green. It looked quiet, untouched. I slowed down, glanced at my phone to see if I had signal, barely one bar, and decided to pull in. The tires crunched over gravel and loose dirt as branches leaned in overhead, blotting out most of the daylight. The road wound deeper into the woods, the occasional shaft of sunlight breaking through the canopy. After a couple of minutes, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a flat, open patch with a ring of old stones in the center, maybe the remnants of a fire pit. Fallen branches littered the ground, and the grass was high in places, swaying in the breeze. It felt far away from everything, the kind of spot you could sit in for hours without hearing a single human sound. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. The silence was heavy. No hum of distant traffic, no chatter of people, just the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of a tree swaying. I stepped out of the car, feeling the soft give of the ground under my shoes. The air smelled different here, richer, like layers of soil and moss and damp bark. I walked around the clearing, kicking at the dirt, running my hand along the rough surface of an old tree trunk. The trees surrounding the clearing were close together, their lower branches bare and upper branches thick with leaves, blocking out most of the sky. In some directions, the forest floor sloped downward, disappearing into darker, thicker growth. I stood still, listening. At first, I could only hear the faint shifting of leaves, but after a while, I noticed how every sound seemed distant, muted, like the air itself was swallowing them. I decided to take a short walk before heading back. I didn't have any gear with me, just my phone, wallet, and a bottle of water, but I figured I'd go no more than a few minutes in and then return. The ground was uneven and soft in places, covered in layers of fallen leaves that gave a faint crackle under my weight. Twigs snapped underfoot with sharp little pops. The deeper I went, the cooler the air became. The light dimmed, replaced by the greenish glow that comes from sunlight filtering through thick leaves. I passed moss-covered logs and clusters of mushrooms sprouting from rotting stumps. Every so often, I'd see a patch of animal tracks pressed into the damp soil. Deer maybe, or something smaller. After about 10 minutes, I realized I had been going downhill. The slope was gradual, but the forest had changed around me. The trees here were even closer together, their trunks dark with moisture. The air was still, almost too still. I stopped to take a sip of water and looked around. I couldn't see the clearing anymore. I turned, trying to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. Layers of trees, the same uneven ground, the same low blanket of leaves. I told myself to stay calm. I hadn't gone that far. All I needed to do was keep walking uphill, and I'd eventually find the clearing again. I picked a direction that looked slightly higher and started moving, keeping my pace steady. My footsteps were loud in the silence, and I started noticing how little else I could hear. No wind, no insects, no bird calls. Just the occasional sound of a branch creaking overhead. After a few minutes, I began to notice something else, a faint sound behind me. It wasn't constant, more like a soft, irregular crunch, as if something was stepping carefully over leaves and twigs. I stopped and turned. The trees stood still and empty. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or maybe a deer, but the sound had matched my pace before stopping when I stopped. I moved again, slower this time, listening. There it was, crunch, pause, crunch. Always a few steps behind. I didn't want to start running, but my chest tightened with the urge to move faster. I tried glancing over my shoulder without fully turning my head, catching only quick flashes of tree trunks and shadow. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. I began to notice the way it seemed to close the distance slightly whenever I slowed down. My breathing quickened, and I found myself gripping the bottle in my hand harder than I needed to, the thin plastic creaking under the pressure. The uphill path I'd been following began to flatten, and I realized I still couldn't see the clearing. I didn't recognize anything. Not the trees, not the shape of the ground, not even the way the light filtered through the branches. My legs felt heavier with every step. The sound behind me didn't fade. At one point, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a darker shape between the trunks, low to the ground, moving when I moved. My throat felt tight. I didn't want to stop, but my body was starting to push back against the steady climb. The ground suddenly dipped into a shallow depression, and I had to step carefully to avoid sliding. At the bottom, the soil was darker and softer, damp enough to hold a fresh set of prints. They were larger than I expected, not quite the shape of a human footprint, but not exactly an animal I could identify either. My stomach twisted. I forced myself up the other side and finally broke into a faster walk. The sound behind me quickened too, not trying to hide anymore. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The forest around me seemed to close in tighter, the trees leaning inward like they were trying to block my way. Then ahead, I saw a break in the trees, light spilling in, brighter than anything I'd seen since leaving the car. I pushed toward it, ignoring the uneven ground and the branches snagging at my sleeves. The sound behind me grew sharper, louder, almost matching my pace now. I burst into the clearing, stumbling onto the patch of high grass. My car was still there, sitting in the same spot, its metal catching the afternoon light. I didn't look back. I walked fast, trying to keep my movements controlled, my hand shaking as I reached for the door handle. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Through the windshield, the trees stood silent and still, but I could feel the weight of the forest pressing at the edges of the clearing, like it was waiting for me to step back inside. I didn't stay to see if anything moved. I backed out slowly, turned the car around, and drove until the dirt road gave way to pavement. The quiet stayed with me the whole way home, not just in my ears, but in my chest, a lingering heaviness that made me think about how easily I had disappeared into those trees, and how close I might have been to not finding my way back. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to take the long way home. The main road was busy, and I had no patience for the constant noise of cars rushing past. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel the air without exhaust fumes in it. I knew a back trail that cut through a wide stretch of woods and eventually connected to a dirt path not far from my street. I'd used it a few times before. It was longer, but there was something about walking through the stillness of the trees that felt better than dealing with the city sounds. The sun was low, but it wasn't quite sunset. The light came through the trees at an angle, painting everything gold. The air smelled like damp earth and dried leaves. The ground was soft in places, covered with layers of pine needles. I could hear my own footsteps, and the faint sound of wind high above in the branches. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the air growing cooler. The trees here were tall and close together, blocking out more of the light. The sound of the city faded away until there was nothing but the occasional creak of wood shifting and the faint rustle of leaves. My pace slowed without me realizing. It wasn't because I was tired. It was because my senses had started to sharpen in that way they do when you suddenly become aware of being alone in a place you can't see all of. I kept walking, following the narrow trail that wound between thick trunks. I knew this part well. There was a fallen tree up ahead that had been lying there for years, half sunk into the dirt. I used it as a marker in my head. When I reached it, I'd be almost halfway through the woods. But as I came around a bend, I noticed something strange. The forest floor ahead looked disturbed. Leaves had been brushed aside in wide arcs, and the dirt underneath was darker, freshly exposed. I slowed down even more. I told myself it was probably just a deer digging around for something. But then I saw the marks, long, deep grooves in the soil, parallel to each other. They were far too wide apart to be made by any deer I'd ever seen. They looked almost like someone had dragged something heavy, maybe a log or... I didn't want to finish the thought. I stepped over them and kept going, but my ears were open now. Every sound felt louder. My boots pressed into the soft dirt, and each step felt like it echoed. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone behind me. But the trail stayed empty. When I reached the fallen tree, I stopped. Normally I would sit here for a minute, maybe drink some water, but something in my body told me to keep moving. That low, prickling tension had settled into my skin. The kind where you feel like you're being watched even if you can't see anyone. I scanned the trees on both sides of the trail. Nothing moved. Still, I walked faster. The forest seemed quieter now, almost unnaturally so. Even the wind had died down. I could hear my breathing. Then, faintly, I caught another sound. A low, irregular crunch. It wasn't constant, just every few seconds, like a footstep falling on dry leaves somewhere off to my left. I didn't stop, but I turned my head slowly in that direction. Between the trees, the shadows were thick, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. I saw no one. The sound came again. Crunch. Then silence. Then crunch. It wasn't in rhythm with my own steps, and that told me enough. Someone, or something, was moving out there. I kept walking, trying to look straight ahead as if I hadn't heard it. My hands had started to sweat, and I could feel my heartbeat picking up. The crunching didn't stop. It didn't get closer, but it didn't fade either. It stayed level with me, always off to the left. That meant whoever it was matching my pace. I thought about breaking into a run, but I knew if I did, it would be obvious that I knew they were there. Instead, I sped up gradually, making my stride longer. The sound kept pace with me. I could hear branches snapping lightly now, like someone brushing past them. Up ahead, the trail forked. The main path went straight, but a smaller one veered right, climbing slightly uphill toward a ridge. I took the smaller path without hesitation, moving fast. It was steeper, and the ground here was rockier, so my steps landed harder. That meant I couldn't hear the other footsteps anymore, which was almost worse. When I reached the top of the ridge, I crouched behind a thick cluster of bushes and turned back, peering down toward where I had come from. My eyes scanned the lower trail, my breath held. For a long moment, nothing happened. The woods below were still. Then I saw movement, a shape passing slowly between the trees. It wasn't close enough for me to see clearly, but I could tell it was human, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a steady, deliberate pace. They didn't look up toward the ridge. They stayed on the lower trail, heading in the same direction I had been going. I waited until they passed out of sight. My muscles felt stiff from crouching so long, but I didn't move until I was sure I couldn't hear anything. Finally, I stood and cut across the ridge, moving in the opposite direction from where they had gone. I didn't take any trails now. I just moved through the trees, stepping over roots, pushing through undergrowth. Every so often, I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the quiet of the forest. But the tension never left. Even when I could see the break in the trees that marked the edge of the woods, I didn't relax. I kept expecting to hear a branch snap behind me. When I finally stepped out into the open, the last of the daylight was fading. I crossed a narrow ditch and found myself on a gravel road I recognized. From here, it was only a short walk back to my street. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. When I reached my front door and locked it behind me, the quiet of my house felt strange. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but heavy. I stood there for a long time, still gripping my keys, feeling the sweat cooling on my skin. I never found out who was in those woods that evening, or why they had been keeping pace with me. But I stopped using that trail completely. And even now, whenever I walk alone, I pay attention to every sound, every shadow, every slow, deliberate crunch of leaves in the distance. It was already late in the afternoon when I decided to take the long walk back home. I had been out in the hills all day, just wandering. There was something about the quiet out there that I liked, the way the wind carried through the grass, the way you could hear your own footsteps crunch against the dirt. I hadn't planned to stay out so long, but I kept going further, following the winding trails and uneven paths that led deeper into areas I had never really explored before. By the time I finally turned around, the sky was already showing that soft, fading light that comes right before sunset. I could feel the temperature dropping. The warm air of the day was being replaced by something cooler, sharper. My jacket wasn't thick enough for the evening chill, but I told myself it wouldn't be long before I reached the main road again. I walked faster, trying to retrace my steps. The trail seemed less familiar now. Out in the distance, the rolling hills and scattered trees looked darker, their edges blurring together as shadows stretched longer across the ground. The light was slipping away fast. I remember glancing over my shoulder more than once. The feeling crept up slowly, like when you think someone might be matching your pace a few steps behind you. There was no one there, just the open land and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. Still, every few minutes I would find myself checking again. My boots made steady crunching sounds on the path, and somewhere far off I could hear the faint call of some birds settling in for the night. The trail narrowed as I went, and the weeds grew taller along the edges. My legs brushed through them, and sometimes they snapped back against my shins. A patch of ground up ahead was damp, my boots sinking slightly as I stepped across it. I noticed footprints pressed deep into the mud, fresher than I expected. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and going in the same direction I was headed. I slowed down without meaning to, staring at them. They looked like they had been made recently, maybe within the hour. I told myself there were plenty of hikers or hunters who came through here, but the thought didn't feel convincing. The air felt heavier the further I went. I could smell the dampness of the soil and something else faintly sharp, almost metallic. My ears tuned into every sound now, the whisper of grass, the scrape of a branch shifting in the wind. I kept telling myself it was just the quiet getting to me, but the tension in my chest kept growing. I tried to walk faster, but my steps still felt too slow. I came to a bend where the trail dipped between two low ridges. The sun was almost gone now, leaving the world in that dim blue light where shapes lose their sharpness. My eyes kept darting to the sides, scanning the edges of the ridge where the grass moved. There was a noise, quick, sudden, a shift of weight on loose stones somewhere above me. I stopped. My breath clouded faintly in the air. Nothing moved. The silence was worse now, like the whole place was holding its breath. I started walking again, but now my footsteps sounded too loud. The path curved again, and then straightened for a while. The ridges gave way to a flat stretch, but the grass was taller here, swaying in the breeze. I couldn't see far ahead. I kept glancing down at the dirt. The same footprints appeared again, only now they were deeper, as if whoever made them had started moving faster. The smell in the air was stronger now. I thought maybe it was an animal carcass somewhere nearby, hidden in the grass. My chest felt tight, my heartbeat heavier. I tried to focus on getting to the road, picturing the faint yellow glow of the street lamp I knew stood near the turnoff. If I could see that light, I'd know I was close. I came to another muddy patch, and this time there were fresh scuff marks in the dirt alongside the footprints, like someone had slipped or turned suddenly. My mind kept trying to make sense of it, but I didn't stop moving. The grass on my left rustled suddenly, sharply, and my legs almost froze. It wasn't the gentle sway from the breeze. It was something pushing through, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I sped up. My hands curled into fists without thinking. My eyes kept trying to catch something in my peripheral vision, but it stayed hidden, moving only when I moved, like it was keeping pace. The sound of it through the grass came and went, sometimes close, sometimes farther off. When the road finally came into view, it was only a faint line between the dark grass and the even darker trees beyond. I could almost make out the street lamp, though it looked dim from this distance. My legs felt heavier with every step now, like I had been walking uphill for miles. I glanced behind me once more, and in that moment I thought I saw movement, just a dark shape sliding between the grass and the shadow of the ridge. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was enough to jolt something in me. I started running. My boots pounded the dirt, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The sound in the grass quickened too, keeping pace. My chest ached, but I didn't stop. The road grew closer, but it still felt far. The street lamp flickered once, or maybe it was just my eyes bouncing with the motion. When I finally reached the edge of the road, I stopped just long enough to turn and look back. The trail behind me was empty, the tall grass swaying gently as if nothing had been there at all. My lungs burned, my hands shook, but nothing moved in the fading light. I stayed there for a few minutes, scanning the path. The air smelled cleaner here, the metallic edge fading. My breathing slowed, but the weight in my chest didn't. Eventually, I walked the rest of the way home without looking back again. Even when I reached my street and saw the familiar houses, my mind kept replaying that stretch of trail, the footprints in the mud, the sound in the grass, and that single flicker of movement before I ran. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every faint noise outside made me think of the sound of something moving just out of sight. I told myself over and over that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a stray dog, but that didn't explain the weight in those footprints, or why it kept perfect pace with me until I reached the road. I've walked that trail plenty of times before, but I haven't gone back since. Even now, weeks later, when I picture it, the light in my memory is always fading, the grass always moving in that slow, steady way, and the sound in my head is always the same, something walking, just far enough away to keep me from seeing it, but close enough to never let me forget it was there. I was driving home late in the evening after a long day at work. The sun had already gone down, and the sky was a deep, dull blue fading into black. The kind of darkness that swallows the edges of the road and makes the headlights feel weaker than they should. I had taken a longer route than usual because I needed to stop by a friend's place to drop something off. His house was in a small rural area, and the quickest way back to my place from there was through an old back road that cut through miles of farmland and wooded stretches. I'd driven that road a handful of times in the past, but only during the day. At night, it felt completely different. There were no streetlights, no houses for long stretches, and the road itself was narrow, just 2 lanes with faded paint lines that were barely visible under my headlights. The pavement was cracked in places, and I could see where old patches had been made years ago, but were now wearing down again. On either side, tall grass and weeds grew right up to the edge, with occasional fence posts leaning at odd angles, some missing entirely. The air felt still, almost heavy, and I noticed I was gripping the steering wheel tighter than normal. My windows were up, but I could still feel that faint chill that comes when you're far from any city, surrounded by open land at night. My radio was off, partly because I wanted to concentrate on the road, but also because, for some reason, I didn't want any noise breaking the quiet. I could hear my tires rolling over the uneven surface, the occasional crunch when a stray bit of gravel or debris scattered under them. The first few miles were uneventful, but then I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile ahead, my headlights caught a faint glint, something reflective low to the ground. At first, I thought it was maybe an animal's eyes catching the light, but as I got closer, it didn't move. It stayed in the same spot near the side of the road. My stomach tightened a bit. As I passed, I realized it was just a crushed soda can lying near the edge, the aluminum catching the beam for a second before disappearing into the darkness behind me. It wasn't anything, but the way my mind had jumped made me realize I was on edge. The road began to dip and curve through a wooded section. The trees on both sides were tall and close together, their branches hanging overhead like a canopy. My headlights lit the trunks in a stark white for just a moment before they slipped back into shadow as I passed. The air seemed even colder here, and I had the strange sensation of being watched, though I knew that was just my nerves. Still, I kept glancing at the mirrors, scanning the thin slices of road behind me lit by my taillights. Halfway through that wooded stretch, I saw something else up ahead. At first, it was just a vague shape, darker than the shadows around it, right at the edge of the road. As I drew closer, the outline sharpened. It was a bag. A large duffel bag lying partly in the grass, partly on the pavement. It looked dirty, the kind of worn you get from being left outside for a while, but it was definitely zipped shut. I slowed slightly as I passed, but I didn't stop. Something about it didn't sit right with me. There was no car nearby, no sign that anyone had dropped it accidentally. It was just there, abandoned, in the middle of nowhere. I told myself it could have fallen off a truck, but my mind kept circling the idea of why someone would leave it there. I didn't like the thought of getting out to check, so I kept driving, though I found myself checking the mirrors again, making sure nothing was moving behind me. After a few more miles, the woods began to thin, giving way to stretches of open farmland. The fields were empty this time of year, just flat expanses of dirt with occasional broken-down barns or rusting farm equipment scattered far off from the road. The moon was only a thin sliver, barely enough to give any extra light. Everything outside my headlights was swallowed up in black. It was in one of these open stretches that I noticed a faint movement in the distance ahead. At first, I thought it was heat haze or maybe a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could see a figure walking along the edge of the road. They were on my side, moving in the same direction I was driving, so I was coming up behind them. There were no sidewalks here, and it was strange to see anyone walking this far from town, especially at night. They were wearing dark clothing, making them hard to see, and their stride was slow, almost deliberate. I eased off the gas slightly, trying to judge what they were doing. As I got within about 50 feet, I realized they weren't carrying a flashlight or anything that made them visible, and something about their posture was strange. They didn't turn or react to my headlights at all. Most people would at least glance back. They just kept walking, heads slightly lowered, arms hanging by their sides. I passed them slowly, keeping my eyes forward, but my peripheral vision caught enough detail to make me uneasy. Their clothes looked dirty, worn, and their shoes were caked with mud. I couldn't see their face clearly. It was shadowed by the angle of the lights, but what little I did see looked pale, almost gray in the harsh beam. Once I was past them, I checked my mirror again. They were still walking, same steady pace, not looking after me. Something about the whole encounter gnawed at me, and I found myself driving faster. The rest of the road ahead stretched empty again, but I couldn't shake the image. That person out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, it didn't feel right. My mind kept going back to the bag I'd seen earlier, the way it was just lying there. Another mile passed, and then, without warning, I saw headlights coming toward me in the opposite lane. A truck. As it drew closer, I realized it was moving fast, maybe faster than it should on this road. We passed each other quickly, and in my mirror, I saw its brake lights flash bright red. It slowed down rapidly, then turned sharply onto the shoulder. That was when I saw it. Its headlights swung and lit up the road behind me for a brief second. In that moment, I caught a glimpse of something that made my chest go tight. The person I had passed earlier was now standing in the middle of the lane, facing the truck. I didn't know what was happening, but instinct told me not to stop. I pressed harder on the gas, watching the mirror until the curve in the road cut off my view. For the next several miles, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about the bag, the figure walking, the way they had appeared suddenly in the lane behind me. It felt like a setup, though I didn't want to admit it. When I finally reached the main highway, the relief I felt was immediate. Streetlights, a bit of traffic, the familiar hum of civilization. It was like stepping back into safety. But even as I drove the rest of the way home, that image stayed in my head. The empty bag on the roadside, the lone figure in the dark, the way they ended up standing in the lane, almost as if they had been waiting for the next car to come along. That night, long after I locked my doors and shut the blinds, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, if I had stopped to check that bag, or if I had been driving just a little slower, things could have gone very differently. I didn't tell anyone about it, but I never drove that back road at night again. And to this day, whenever I see something lying abandoned by the side of a rural road, I keep driving. Because I know now that sometimes, what you think is just a harmless object left behind might be the start of something you never want to be part of. It had been one of those warm, still summer evenings where the air felt thick and heavy. The kind of night where sound carried strangely far, and the smallest noises from the distance seemed sharper than they should be. I had decided to go for a walk on the outskirts of town, following a narrow road that eventually curved into a more rural area. I didn't have a real plan for how far I'd go. I just wanted to be alone for a while, to let my thoughts drift while my feet carried me forward. The sun had dipped low behind the tree line, the orange fading into that bluish haze that comes right before true darkness. The road was quiet, lined on both sides by tall grass and scattered trees. Off to my right, I could see an old fence that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Wooden posts leaning at odd angles, strands of rusted wire hanging loosely between them. Beyond the fence was an open field, and far past that, the edge of a dense forest. The further I walked, the less I could hear of the town behind me. No cars, no voices, just the steady sound of my own footsteps on the gravel shoulder of the road and the faint chirping of crickets hidden in the grass. I could smell the faint scent of dry dirt and something sweet, maybe wildflowers, though it was hard to tell with the air so still. I had walked this way during the day before, but never at night. The change in light made the familiar path feel unfamiliar. Shapes that I recognized in daylight were now just dark, unidentifiable masses. I passed a small gravel driveway that led to an abandoned farmhouse. I'd seen it before, boarded up windows, peeling white paint, the roof sagging in the middle. There was no driveway gate, just a pair of weathered posts and weeds pushing up through the gravel. Normally I wouldn't think much of it, but tonight something about it made me pick up my pace. The house sat back at least 100 feet from the road, but even from here, it felt like the kind of place where the walls held too many stories you didn't want to know. By the time I reached the bend in the road, the last light had drained from the sky. The moon hadn't risen yet, so everything was lit only by that dim, residual glow from the horizon. I could still see the outlines of the trees against the sky, but the ground around me was dark. My shoes crunched over loose gravel, and the sound seemed louder now. That was when I heard it, something moving in the grass behind me. It wasn't a small rustle like a mouse or bird would make. This was slower, heavier. I stopped walking and held still, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant chirping. Then I heard it again, several slow steps through dry grass, the sound of stems bending and snapping under weight. I turned my head just enough to glance over my shoulder, but I couldn't see much through the darkness. The field on the left side of the road was open, but the right side, the one with the fence, had patches of trees and undergrowth that were now just a deep wall of black. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a stray dog, and kept walking. My pace was faster now, my breathing a little more noticeable in my own ears. The footsteps in the grass followed. They weren't matching mine exactly. They'd stop for a few seconds, then start again, almost like whoever or whatever was there was pausing to listen to me before continuing. The sound stayed close, maybe 20 or 30 feet back, but I still couldn't see anything when I glanced behind me. I kept walking, trying not to make it obvious that I was aware of the noise. The road narrowed as it went uphill, and to my right, the ground sloped down sharply toward a thicket of trees. The fence was gone now, replaced by just a sharp drop into shadow. I realized how isolated this stretch was. If someone stepped out from the trees, there would be nowhere for me to go except forward or backward. As I crested the hill, my stomach sank. Ahead of me, the road stretched into darkness without a single streetlight. I could see the silhouette of another stand of trees blocking most of the horizon, and between me and those trees was nothing but black. The footsteps behind me stopped again, and the silence was almost worse than the sound. I told myself I should just turn around and head back toward town. At least that way I'd be walking toward light instead of into nothing. I slowed down, ready to turn, when I heard a sound that made my chest tighten. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind you only hear when someone's standing close enough for you to know it's meant for you to hear. I froze completely. My skin felt cold, even though the air was warm. The sound had come from my right, just off the edge of the road where the drop-off was. I didn't dare look fully, but I could see the faint outline of movement in the dark. Something, or someone, was standing just past the edge, perfectly still now. I forced my legs to move and started walking again, this time faster. My steps felt clumsy, too loud. I could hear my own breathing getting heavier, and I hated how much noise I was making. Every few steps, I caught more movement in my peripheral vision, subtle shifts, like whoever was there was keeping pace just out of sight. The road finally started to curve back downhill, and I knew that a small bridge was coming up. Underneath it was a shallow creek, usually just a trickle, but the trees around it made that part of the road even darker. I didn't want to go through it, but I didn't have a choice. As I reached the bridge, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were faster, closing the distance between us. My pulse pounded in my ears, and without thinking, I broke into a jog. The crunch of gravel under my shoes mixed with the sound of something moving quickly through the grass and dirt beside me. When I reached the other side of the bridge, I finally looked back. For just a second, in the faint light from the horizon, I saw a shape, tall, human, hunched slightly forward. It didn't move when I turned, but I knew it had been following me. I didn't stop running. The road ahead began to climb again, and I could see the faint glow of town lights in the far distance. My lungs burned, and my legs felt heavy, but I didn't slow down until I was well past the last bend and could see houses ahead. When I finally stopped, I turned back one last time. The road was empty. No sound but the faint rustle of leaves in the warm night air. But I knew that if I had walked any slower, or turned to see too soon, I might not have made it back. Even now, when I walk that way in daylight, I can still picture that stretch of road exactly as it was that night, quiet, empty, but never really alone. It was late summer, one of those warm days where the sun never seems to hurry down, and the air smells faintly of dry grass and dirt. I had decided to go for a walk, not for exercise, not for any real reason, just to get away from the noise of everything. There was a place a couple miles from where I lived, a stretch of old county land. Half pasture, half overgrown brush, with a small creek cutting through it. It wasn't exactly a park, but people wandered there sometimes, mostly during the day. It was one of those forgotten edges of town that never fully belonged to anyone. The trail into it wasn't even marked. You had to know where to step off the cracked back road and push through a break in the wire fence. The grass there was high and dry, brushing against my legs as I moved. A few birds scattered as I passed, their wings clapping against the air. I walked without thinking, letting the faint path guide me. The dirt underfoot was dusty, crumbling a little under my shoes, and every now and then I heard the crunch of small stones shifting. About a half-mile in, the ground dipped, and the trail wound close to the creek. The water was low this time of year, just a narrow strip cutting through mud banks, glinting in the light. I paused for a moment to watch the slow ripple, my shadow stretching across to the opposite side. The place was quiet, too quiet, I noticed once I was still. No wind, no insects buzzing, just the faint gurgle of water and my own breathing. The air felt heavier here, not in a way that made sense, but in that subtle, instinctive way your body notices before your mind does. I shrugged it off and kept walking. The trail veered away from the creek and cut into thicker brush. Trees started to appear, thin at first, spaced far apart, but getting denser as I moved forward. Their leaves cast shifting shadows on the ground, and the dirt became darker, cooler, packed tighter by shade. After another 10 minutes, the trail split. One path kept on toward the edge of the property, where I knew it would loop back to the road. The other sloped down toward a hollow I'd never explored before. Something about it made me hesitate. The air seemed even heavier in that direction, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just curiosity pulling me, but part of me already knew I should have kept going on the main path. I followed the slope down. The trees here grew closer together, their branches crossing overhead and dimming the light. The ground was littered with leaves and twigs that cracked under each step. A faint smell hung in the air. Damp earth mixed with something sharper, something faintly metallic. The hollow opened up after a short walk. It wasn't wide, maybe 50 feet across, ringed with trees whose roots curled up from the soil like knotted ropes. The ground here was uneven, with shallow dips and mounds. In the center was a patch of flattened grass, like something, or someone, had been lying there for a long time. I stopped at the edge, scanning the area without moving closer. That's when I noticed it, deep, irregular impressions in the dirt around the flattened patch. They weren't shoe prints, at least not any I recognized. They were longer, narrower, and sunk deeper into the ground, as if whatever made them had been heavy. They trailed off toward the far side of the hollow, vanishing into shadow. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring. The air seemed to press against me, my chest feeling tighter. My ears strained for sound, but the silence was total. That metallic smell was stronger here. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A shift, faint but unmistakable, between the trees on the far side. I turned toward it instinctively, my body already stiff. The shadows there were thick, layered. For a second, I told myself it was just a branch swaying, but there was no wind. Then I saw the shape, tall, solid, standing still. I couldn't make out its features in the gloom, but it was there, half concealed, watching. My skin prickled. Every part of me screamed to back away, but my legs felt like they were locked in place. I stared at it, and it didn't move. Not a shift, not a sound. I realized then that I had been holding my breath without knowing. Slowly, I stepped back, trying to keep my movement steady. The shape didn't follow, not at first. I kept stepping back until my heel caught on a root, and I stumbled, breaking the silence with a sharp snap of a twig. That sound seemed to change everything. The shape moved. It was sudden, fast, crossing into deeper shadow so quickly I couldn't follow its outline. That was enough for me. I turned and started back the way I came, forcing myself to walk and not run. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my neck. Every step felt too loud, the sound of my shoes crunching leaves carrying through the stillness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trees behind me seemed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When I reached the split in the trail, I took the main path without hesitation. The air here felt just as heavy, but now it carried a faint rustle behind me, a sound too steady to be the wind. I didn't look back this time. I walked faster, the rhythm of my steps quickening until it became an outright run. The path blurred beneath me. I broke out of the trees near the creek, and for a moment, the open space gave me hope. But as I crossed the bank, my foot slid in the mud, and I went down hard, my hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. I scrambled up without pausing, wiping nothing away, and kept moving. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop until I was through the break in the fence, back on the cracked asphalt of the road. Only then did I turn around. The gap in the fence was empty. The brush was still. I stood there, bent over, catching my breath, the late sun now low enough to turn everything gold. The world looked the same as when I had left, but it didn't feel the same anymore. I never went back there after that day. I told myself there was probably an explanation for what I'd seen and heard, but deep down I knew the truth. There are places where you don't belong, places where something is always watching. And sometimes if you get too close, it decides to follow. It had been a long, hot day, the kind that drains you even when you're not doing much. By the time the sun began to dip low, the air finally started to cool. I was driving back from a small hardware store in the nearest town, which was still a good 40-minute trip from my place. The two-lane road twisted through miles of farmland and patches of thick trees that grew right up to the edge of the asphalt. The sun's light was fading into a deep orange glow, and the shadows in the tree lines stretched long across the road. I had both windows cracked, letting in the smell of warm earth and dry grass. The road was almost completely empty. I might have seen 2 cars the entire time since leaving town. The nearest houses were scattered miles apart. Most of the time, it felt like the road cut through nothing but open fields and dense pockets of woods. I'd driven it many times, but I'd never felt entirely comfortable on it at night. There was something about how quiet it got out there once the light faded, the way the woods seemed to swallow the world. As I came around a bend, I noticed movement on the right shoulder ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer stepping out of the trees, but the shape was all wrong. It was taller, upright, walking along the edge of the road with an odd, slow gait. My headlights hadn't reached it yet, so I couldn't make out much detail, just the silhouette. Whoever it was didn't turn toward my car. They just kept walking, their heads slightly down, hands at their sides. I slowed down without even thinking about it, my foot easing off the gas. When the beams finally lit them up, I could see they were wearing what looked like old, dirty clothes, dark pants, and a long-sleeved shirt. The shirt was loose and hung oddly, the sleeves covering most of the hands. I didn't recognize the person, and that wasn't surprising since I didn't really know everyone in the area. But something about the way they moved bothered me. They weren't walking like someone going somewhere. It was too slow, too steady, like they were pacing themselves to match something I couldn't see. As I passed them, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, like my body was warning me about something. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting them to turn and watch me go. But they didn't. They just kept walking, head slightly down, same pace, same direction. For some reason, that unsettled me even more than if they'd stared right at me. The road ahead dipped and curved through another stretch of woods, and for a moment, I tried to shake off the feeling. People walked along roads all the time, especially out here where there weren't many other options for travel. Maybe their car had broken down somewhere, or maybe they lived nearby. I told myself it wasn't worth thinking about. but I kept glancing at my mirrors, expecting to see something that wasn't there. I drove another mile or so, and just as I was starting to relax, I caught sight of movement up ahead again. My stomach sank. On the right shoulder, in the dim orange light from the last of the sunset, was a figure walking. Same height, same clothes, same slow, steady gait. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. It wasn't possible. I hadn't passed any turnoffs they could have taken, and even if they'd somehow cut across a field, there was no way they could have gotten ahead of me that quickly. I slowed again, scanning them as I got closer. My headlights illuminated the back of their shirt, and my pulse kicked up when I realized it looked exactly the same as the person I'd passed earlier. The shirt was dirty in the same places, like streaks of dried mud across the lower back and sides. Their hair, dark and a little messy, was the same length. This time, as I drew alongside, I looked closer at their hands. The sleeves were still covering most of them, but the skin I could see was pale, almost gray in the low light. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas a little more and kept moving, my eyes flicking between the road and the mirror until the figure disappeared behind a curve. I told myself it was probably just two different people. Maybe there was a small road hidden in the trees I'd never noticed before. But the back of my neck stayed tense, and my thoughts kept circling the same question. What if it wasn't two people? What if it was the same one, somehow ahead of me again? I drove faster than usual for the next few miles, the road twisting through alternating stretches of open land and shadowed woods. Every time the trees opened up to another long straightaway, I scanned the shoulder ahead. Most of the time, it was empty. But then I saw it again. This time, the figure was on the left side of the road, walking in the same direction I was going. The sun had dropped completely now, and the only light was from my headlights. The sight of them sent a shiver through me. They were the same distance from the road, same posture, same pace. My mind started trying to work through possibilities, but none of them made sense. I'd been driving too fast for anyone on foot to keep up, and there was no sign of any other vehicles or shortcuts. I passed them again, not even daring to glance over this time. I just kept my eyes forward and pushed the car harder along the road. My heart was pounding now. The empty stretches felt too open, the wooded stretches too closed in. I started imagining scenarios I didn't want to think about. What if I saw them ahead again, but this time in the middle of the road, or what if they stepped out as I passed? The road eventually came to a long uphill stretch, and I could see the crest ahead. My high beams illuminated the top, but the other side was hidden. I slowed slightly as I reached the rise, then my headlights spilled down the slope, and my stomach dropped. There they were again, halfway down the hill, walking away from me right in the center of my lane. I hit the brakes hard, the tires skidding slightly on the rough pavement. The figure didn't react at all. They just kept walking, slow and steady, like they didn't even notice the car behind them. My hands were sweating, my breathing shallow. I didn't want to pass them on such a narrow road, but I also didn't want to stop here in the middle of nowhere. I eased onto the horn, a short blast, and the sound cut through the night. The figure moved to the side without turning around. I passed them, heart hammering, and didn't look back. The rest of the drive was a blur of empty road and the sound of my own pulse in my ears. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my body felt tight, like every muscle had been clenched for the last 20 minutes. I sat there for a long moment before getting out, scanning the darkness along the tree line beside my house. Nothing moved. No sound but the insects and the faint rustle of leaves. But as I reached my door and turned to glance back down the road, I had the strange, gut-deep certainty that if I drove that route tomorrow, or the next day, or the next week, I'd see them again, same clothes, same pace, same steady walk. And the thought that they could always be somewhere ahead of me, waiting, was worse than anything I'd felt out there on the road. It was still dark outside when I left the house, the kind of early morning where the cold sticks to your skin and your breath hangs in the air like a thin mist. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the distant hum of a truck somewhere far away. I had decided to take the back road to clear my head. It was longer and less traveled, but it passed through an area I liked, open fields, scattered trees, and then a stretch of thick woods. I'd walked that way before, though not often, and only during the day. The first part of the walk felt peaceful. The frost on the grass crunched softly under my shoes, and the air had that sharp, clean smell it gets before the sun rises. My hands were buried deep in my jacket pockets, my shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. Every so often, I could hear the faint flutter of a bird startled from its perch, but otherwise it was silent. There was no wind, no movement, nothing but the sound of my own steps. The road eventually curved toward the woods. From a distance, the tree line looked like a solid black wall, with no light seeping through. As I got closer, I noticed how heavy the shadows were beneath the branches. Even though I knew the path well enough, I slowed down a little. The trees here were tall and close together, their trunks thick and their roots breaking through the ground in knotted, uneven lines. When I stepped under the cover of the trees, the temperature seemed to drop instantly. The damp smell of earth replaced the cold freshness of the open air. My footsteps sounded different here, muffled by layers of wet leaves and patches of soft soil. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving, telling myself it was just a short stretch before I reached the other side. A few minutes in, I became aware of how quiet it had gotten. It wasn't just the usual forest quiet. It was as if even the smallest sounds had been shut off. No birds, no rustle of leaves, no distant traffic, just my own footsteps and breathing. That stillness made me tense without realizing it. My pace quickened. I told myself I was imagining it when I thought I heard a faint crunch somewhere off to my right. I kept walking, eyes forward, not wanting to look. Another crunch came, this time to my left. It wasn't constant, just one step, then nothing. My throat felt dry, and I noticed I had stopped breathing evenly. The air around me felt heavier. The road narrowed in this part, bordered by thick brush and undergrowth that would be hard to push through. I realized that whatever was making the sound wasn't coming from behind me, but was keeping pace alongside me, hidden in the trees. Every few seconds, I'd hear it, a slow, deliberate step on leaves. Not an animal scurrying, not the random creak of a branch. It was too controlled, too spaced out. I thought about stopping to listen more carefully, but I didn't want to give away that I'd noticed. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint strip of road ahead, pretending nothing was wrong. My heartbeat was loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. I was counting my steps without meaning to, waiting for the next sound from the side. It came again, closer this time. My body reacted before my mind caught up. Shoulders tight, every muscle tense, my hands curling into fists inside my pockets. I started walking faster, and I heard the pace beside me match. The road soon began to curve, leading deeper into the trees before turning sharply toward the open fields again. The bend meant I couldn't see the way out yet. I kept telling myself I just needed to make it to the clearing. Once I could see open space, I'd feel safer. As I walked, the sound shifted. I could hear more than just footsteps now. There was a faint, steady breathing. Not my own. It was slow, deep, and slightly ragged, like someone taking careful breaths through their nose. It was close enough that I could tell it wasn't an echo or some trick of the forest. I didn't look. My mind told me to, but my instincts screamed not to. If I looked, I'd be acknowledging it. I just kept moving, each step feeling heavier than the last. My skin was prickling, the hairs on my arms standing up despite the layers I wore. When the curve in the road finally gave way, I saw the pale glow of the open fields up ahead. It couldn't have been more than 50 feet away, but it felt like a mile. The breathing was louder now, the steps closer. I could hear small twigs breaking under weight. Not the quick snaps of a deer, but the careful, deliberate pressure of something avoiding too much noise. I made the choice without thinking. I broke into a jog. My shoes slid slightly on the damp leaves, but I kept going. The sound beside me quickened too, matching me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. My breaths came sharp and fast, and my hands were sweating inside my pockets. When I finally burst out of the woods into the open, the sudden lightness of the air felt like a shock. The frost-covered grass stretched out on either side, and in the distance, I could see the faint outline of a barn and a few fence posts. I kept running for another 30 feet before I dared to stop and turn around. The woods behind me were still. Nothing moved between the trees. There was no sound, no shadow, no sign that anything had been there at all. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, my ears straining for any noise. Nothing. I waited a long time, longer than I needed to, before starting to walk again. Even then, I kept glancing back over my shoulder every few steps. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, not even when the trees were far behind me. By the time I reached the main road again, the sun was beginning to rise. The warmth of the light didn't help much. I still felt that same cold in my chest, that same heaviness in the pit of my stomach. I knew that if I ever had to take that route again, I'd think about every step of that morning. The silent woods, the matching footsteps, and the steady breathing that had followed me all the way to the edge. I never saw who or what it was, and maybe that was the worst part. Because whatever it wasn't in a hurry. It didn't rush me, didn't try to cut me off. It just stayed there, moving with me, keeping its distance, as if it had all the time in the world. And knowing that made the open road ahead feel just as unsafe as the woods I had left behind. It had been a long week, and I wanted to clear my head. I didn't have any particular plan, just the thought of driving somewhere far away from the noise and spending a quiet evening on my own seemed enough. I threw a few things into my car: a jacket, some water, snacks, a flashlight, and my phone charger. I didn't check the fuel gauge properly, but I told myself it was fine. I had half a tank, maybe a little less. I drove without much direction, following smaller and smaller roads until I ended up in an unfamiliar stretch of countryside. The sun was dipping lower, spilling long shadows across open fields. A narrow road cut through a patch of woods, and the trees crowded close, their branches arching overhead, so the light dimmed much faster than it should have. The pavement was cracked in places, moss starting to grow along the edges. I passed no other cars for what felt like a long time. I kept driving until the road bent sharply and leveled out into a small dirt pull-off. It overlooked a slope of tangled undergrowth leading down into a wider clearing. I decided to stop there, kill the engine, and just sit for a while. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the faint creak of the car cooling down and the distant rustle of leaves far below. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes before I decided to stretch my legs. I locked the car and followed what looked like a faint deer trail leading down into the clearing. The air was cooler under the trees, the ground soft with damp leaves. The smell of wet soil was strong, and each step sank slightly into the earth. I walked slowly, looking around at the tangled roots and fallen branches. The trail wasn't really a trail at all. It narrowed until I had to push through branches that caught on my jacket. I reached a small dip in the ground where water had pooled into a shallow, muddy basin. The mud was dark, almost black, and thick enough that the surface had cracked in a strange pattern as it dried around the edges. Something about the shape of the cracks made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't have explained why. I turned to head back, but when I glanced uphill toward where I thought my car was parked, I realized I'd gone farther than I meant to. The slope looked steeper from here, the trees more tightly packed. I picked a direction I thought was right and began climbing. Halfway up, I froze. A faint sound came from somewhere off to my left, soft at first, like fabric brushing against something rough. Then a heavier, slower sound, like a foot pressing into damp earth. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer, but it didn't sound like one. There was a rhythm to it, a careful, deliberate weight. I moved a little faster, trying not to make too much noise. The air felt heavier, the dim light between the trunks making it harder to see more than a few steps ahead. I stopped again to listen. The sound had stopped too. I kept climbing until I spotted the faint glint of my car's windshield through the trees. Relief was immediate, but it didn't last. As I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The driver's side door was slightly open. I had locked it. I was certain I had locked it. I stayed where I was crouched low, listening. There was no movement around the car. No sound of someone inside. The woods were silent, too silent. My pulse felt heavy in my ears. I waited another minute before approaching. The inside of the car looked untouched. My jacket and water bottle were still there. But the lock was up. I closed it quietly and locked it again, glancing into the rearview mirror out of habit, even though the engine was still off. That's when I saw something that made my skin crawl. Far back down the slope, in the dimness between the trunks, there was a pale shape. Not white, not bright, just lighter than everything else around it. It was still, too still. I blinked and it was gone, but the shadows felt thicker where it had been. I started the car immediately. The sound of the engine was too loud in the quiet, and I half expected something to rush toward me from the trees. I backed up onto the road and started driving, a little faster than was safe for how narrow and cracked it was. I had only gone about a mile when I realized the fuel gauge was much lower than before. It didn't make sense. I'd been idling earlier, but not long enough for that much fuel to burn. The needle was close to empty now. I slowed down, scanning for any sign of a gas station or even a farmhouse. There was nothing, just the winding road and more trees. The sky was almost completely dark, and the headlights caught little more than the twisting pavement and the reflective eyes of small animals darting into the brush. Then I saw a movement ahead. A figure stepped onto the road from the right side. My stomach dropped. It was standing just at the edge of the beam of my headlights, still and upright. I slowed, but I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to look past it without focusing too much on its shape. As I drew closer, it stepped back into the trees. I drove past the spot without turning my head. My hands were tight on the wheel, my heartbeat loud in my chest. The road curved again, and that's when I noticed something in the side mirror, movement far behind, in the spill of red from my taillights. For a moment, it looked like someone walking in the center of the road, following at a steady pace. I pressed harder on the gas. The gauge was almost on the empty line now, and I had no idea how far the next town was. The road stretched on, each curve revealing more darkness. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, I saw a faint glow ahead, a cluster of streetlights. The first building I reached was a small, rundown gas station. I pulled in fast, parked by the pump, and looked around. The road behind me was empty. Inside the station, it smelled faintly of oil and dust. The man behind the counter barely looked up. I filled the tank, keeping my eyes on the road the entire time. Nothing moved out there. When I finally got back into the driver's seat, I sat for a moment with the engine running, the doors locked, and my hands still gripping the wheel. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods, or how the fuel dropped so quickly, but I do know that I will never drive aimlessly into that part of the countryside again. Even now, I sometimes wake in the night thinking I hear that slow, deliberate sound, something moving through damp leaves, always just far enough away that I can't see it. And every time, I remember the pale shape between the trees and the open car door that should have been locked. It started as an ordinary day, the kind that felt too quiet to predict what was coming. I woke up early, packed a small backpack with snacks, water, a flashlight, and my old pocket knife. The plan was simple: go for a long hike along the ridge trail just outside town, follow it into the deeper woods, and return before sunset. I'd done it before, though never alone this far out. The weather was calm, the air cool but not cold, and there wasn't much wind. The kind of day where sound carries far, and you can hear every bird, every rustle in the leaves. The trail started out wide and firm, dirt packed down by hikers and bikers. I moved at an easy pace, the crunch of my boots steady, my breathing slow. As I went farther, the forest seemed to pull in around me. The sunlight had a harder time getting through the branches overhead, and the air got heavier. The packed dirt turned to uneven ground with roots and small stones. I kept checking my watch, making mental notes of how far I'd gone. It wasn't until I passed an old, fallen tree I didn't remember seeing before that I noticed something felt off. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a creeping awareness. A sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks, how the stillness can make the smallest noise sound close. But then I heard it again, a faint crunch, out of rhythm with my own steps. I stopped. The sound stopped. I stayed still for a moment, letting my ears do the work. The forest around me was silent, except for the occasional distant chirp of a bird. I shifted my pack, took a drink of water, and continued. After a few minutes, there it was again, a careful, slow step on dry leaves, behind me but far enough that I couldn't see anything when I glanced back. I kept walking, faster now, trying not to make it obvious. The trail dipped into a small hollow where the air smelled faintly of damp soil and decaying plants. That smell was stronger than it should have been for such dry weather. I could feel the weight of the backpack pulling on my shoulders as I leaned forward up the other side of the hollow. My heart was beating harder now, not quite panicked, but close. The crunching behind me came again, then stopped. I turned quickly this time, scanning between the tree trunks and low brush. Nothing, just the still shapes of the trees, standing too straight, too quiet. The ridge trail eventually narrowed to a thin path with a steep drop on one side and dense forest on the other. If someone was following me, they had to be somewhere behind, using the trees for cover. I tested this theory by stopping suddenly and pretending to adjust my boot. The silence stretched. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard it again, quieter this time, as if they were being more careful. I started moving again, my pace just slow enough to hear them try to match it. My palms felt damp. A little farther on, the trail took me into the deepest part of the woods, where the canopy above blocked nearly all the sunlight. The air was cooler here, almost cold, and my skin prickled. My breathing sounded too loud in the stillness, every inhale and exhale bouncing back at me from the trees. I realized that if something happened here, no one would hear it. No one would even know where to look. I decided to take a side path I knew about, barely visible under the overgrowth. It was narrow, winding, and steep, leading down toward a dried-up creek bed. I stepped onto it, ducking under branches, pushing through ferns and thorny vines. The sounds behind me followed. They weren't as steady now, sometimes a quick shuffle, sometimes a long pause, like they were waiting for me to stop first. By the time I reached the creek bed, I could feel my pulse in my ears. I crouched low and moved along the dry, rocky channel, where my own steps would be quieter. The high banks on either side gave me cover, but also trapped me. After about 50 yards, I climbed the bank and crawled up to the edge to look back. There was movement, quick, small, low to the ground, slipping between two trees on the other side of the creek. I couldn't make out what it was, only that it was definitely not a deer or any other animal that belonged here. The movement was deliberate, following me. I pressed myself against the bank, forcing myself to stay still. My breathing was sharp and shallow, and my legs ached from the crouch, but I didn't move. Minutes passed, and I heard nothing. Then a soft scrape, like the sound of a boot on rock. I stayed low and began moving forward again, faster now, every muscle in my body ready to run. The trail reconnected with the main path about half a mile ahead, and from there it was another mile back to where I'd parked. It sounded short in my head, but every step felt like it took hours. The sound of my own footsteps was swallowed by the forest, and in the gaps between them, I kept hearing faint, quick bursts of movement behind me. The trees blurred as I pushed forward, the uneven ground threatening to trip me. My backpack thumped with each step. My throat was dry, and I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline. I didn't dare look back again. When I finally saw the faint glint of sunlight through the trees where the trail opened, relief hit me like a wave. I didn't slow down until I broke out into the clearing where my car was parked. I yanked the door open, tossed my pack inside, and slid into the seat, locking the doors. My chest heaved as I scanned the tree line. The forest looked calm, still, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time, watching, waiting for some sign of movement. There was none. I drove away slowly at first, my hands tight on the wheel. Only when I reached the main road did I start to breathe more evenly. But the feeling didn't leave me. Even hours later, sitting at home, I kept replaying the sound of those footsteps in my head. They had matched mine too perfectly, paused when I paused, moved when I moved. I had no proof of who or what it was, but I knew without question that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever it was had stayed just far enough to keep out of sight, and just close enough to make sure I never forgot the sound of them following me through the woods. And I haven't. Even now, I can still hear it when the house gets too quiet. The slow, deliberate crunch of someone keeping pace, waiting. I woke up before the sun, the air still heavy with the kind of damp chill that clings to you even when you're wrapped in a sleeping bag. My back ached from the uneven ground under the thin foam pad, and the smell of cold earth and faint smoke from last night's fire drifted into my nose. I could hear the slow drip of water from the leaves above, tiny droplets landing on the tarp stretched over my tent. The forest around me was quiet, not silent, but filled with small, distant noises. The occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush, the creak of a tree swaying in the morning breeze, a bird calling out somewhere far off. I pushed myself up, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the pale light of early dawn. The campsite looked still, almost too still. The embers of the fire had gone cold, their soft orange glow gone, leaving only gray ash. The grass was wet with dew, soaking the cuffs of my pants almost instantly. My breath fogged in front of me as I looked toward the tree line. The forest stood dark and thick, the kind of darkness that doesn't lift even when the sun comes up. I had planned this trip to be away from everything. No phone service, no city noise, no interruptions. Just me, my gear, and a few days to hike, fish, and camp out in the backcountry. I had chosen a spot well off the main trail, somewhere that, according to the map, would take at least a couple of hours of bushwhacking to reach. It was as far from people as I could get without needing serious climbing equipment. The first day had been fine. I'd hiked in, set up camp near a slow-moving creek, caught a couple of small fish, and sat by the fire until night fell. The stars were bright enough to make me forget how far from home I was. But now, as I stood there in the cold morning air, I felt something different. I couldn't explain it, but it was like a pressure in my chest, as if the forest was leaning in listening. I decided to head deeper into the woods to gather more firewood before breakfast. The fire the night before had eaten through most of what I'd collected, and I didn't want to be stuck without enough for the evening. I grabbed my hatchet, slung my pack over my shoulder, and made my way toward the thicker part of the forest. The ground was uneven, soft in some spots from the recent rain, and littered with fallen branches and slick leaves. I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The smell of damp soil grew stronger the farther I went, mixed with the sharp scent of pine. My boots made a muffled thud on the soft earth. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found a fallen tree that looked perfect for splitting into kindling. I knelt beside it, testing the wood with the hatchet. It was solid, dry inside despite the wet bark. I started chopping, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. It was faint, low, and irregular, a sound of breathing. Not the short, sharp breaths of an animal moving fast, but slow, heavy exhales, like someone trying to control their breathing, but not quite managing it. I froze, my hand tightening around the hatchet handle. The sound came from behind me, somewhere in the trees. I turned my head slowly, scanning the shadows between the trunks. I didn't see anything, but the breathing didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I took a step back, my boot sinking slightly into the soft ground. The breathing shifted, as if whatever it was had moved too. Still, I saw no movement, just the dark shapes of the trees, their branches twisted like reaching hands. I waited, holding my breath, listening. After what felt like minutes, the sound began to fade, growing fainter until it was gone. I stood there for a while longer, my heart pounding, before finally turning back to the fallen tree. My hands felt clumsy as I chopped at the wood. Every crack of the hatchet sounded too loud, too sharp, as if it might call that sound back again. When I had enough wood, I bundled it with rope and started back toward camp. The walk felt longer than it had on the way out. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The forest seemed to watch from all directions. Back at camp, I dropped the wood near the fire pit and sat on a log. My mouth was dry. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or an elk, something curious about the noise I was making. But deep down, I knew the sound I'd heard hadn't been the sound of an animal. It had been too controlled, too human. The rest of the day passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I stepped away from camp, even just to fill my water bottle at the creek, I found myself scanning the trees, looking for movement. The sky turned gray in the afternoon, and the air grew colder. By evening, I had a fire going again, its warmth a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Night in the forest is different when you're alone. Every sound seems closer, every shadow deeper. The crack of a branch becomes a footstep, the rustle of leaves becomes someone shifting their weight. I sat by the fire until the wood was nearly gone, staring into the flames and trying not to listen too closely to what was happening beyond their light. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my hatchet within arm's reach. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by dreams I couldn't remember and the constant sense that something was just outside. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the faint sound of movement, soft, deliberate steps circling the tent. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my ears straining to follow the sound. It would move a few feet, pause, then move again. I could hear the weight of it pressing into the damp ground. My heart hammered so loudly I was afraid it would give me away. The steps stopped behind my tent. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I pictured someone standing there, just beyond the thin nylon wall, listening. The air inside the tent felt heavy and stale. My fingers tightened around the hatchet handle. Minutes passed. Finally, the steps began again, moving slowly away into the trees until they faded into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle tense, waiting for them to return. When the first pale light filtered through the trees, I packed my gear in silence. My hands were stiff with cold, and my shoulders ached from the constant tension. I doused the fire pit, slung my pack on, and started the long hike back toward the main trail. The forest seemed to close in behind me as I walked, each step taking me farther from that small clearing, but not from the memory of the night. Every so often, I thought I heard the sound of breathing again, faint and far off, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky had cleared, and the world felt open again. Cars were parked nearby, and the distant hum of the highway reached my ears. But even with the noise of civilization around me, I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere, deep in that forest, someone had been watching me. Not passing through, not by chance, but staying just far enough away to keep hidden. And they had come close enough, in the middle of the night, to circle my tent. I had planned the trip for weeks, thinking it would be nothing more than a quiet day out, something to clear my head and get away from the constant noise of daily life. I chose a remote area I had read about online, a stretch of land far from any main roads, surrounded by thick forest with a narrow river winding through it. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. I packed some food, water, and a few basic supplies, thinking it would just be a peaceful hike and maybe a bit of exploring. I didn't realize how different things would feel once I was actually out there. The road to the trailhead was rough and unpaved, with potholes and loose gravel that made the drive slow. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization there were. No houses, no shops, no cars passing in the opposite direction, just mile after mile of silent land. When I finally parked, I was the only car there. I remember stepping out, hearing the crunch of gravel under my boots, and noticing how still the air was. No wind, no birds, nothing. It was the kind of silence that made you instinctively lower your voice, even if there was no one around. The trail started off wide and easy, with low bushes on either side and tall trees scattered further back. The air was cool and carried that damp, earthy smell of soil and moss. I walked at an even pace, keeping my breathing steady, enjoying the solitude. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and the trees began to close in. The canopy above blocked much of the light, turning the path into a dim tunnel. I didn't mind, it was calming in its own way, but I started to notice how the silence felt heavier here. Even my footsteps sounded different, softer, almost swallowed up by the damp ground. As I continued, I saw fewer signs that anyone had been there recently. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing. Just untouched forest. The ground sloped gently upward, and I followed the trail as it curved around a large hill. I stopped to take a sip of water, leaning against a tree. That's when I thought I heard something. A faint, quick movement off to my right, deeper in the woods. I froze, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a bird I couldn't see and kept going. But the sound had pulled me out of the relaxed rhythm I'd been in. The trail began to climb more steeply, and I noticed the undergrowth getting denser. I had to push branches aside, and the ground was uneven with roots sticking out like traps. Every now and then, I caught the faint sound of movement again. It was never close, never loud, but it was there, just enough to make me aware of it. It felt like something was keeping pace with me, staying hidden. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the normal sounds of a forest, but my mind kept circling back to the fact that I hadn't seen a single animal all day. By early afternoon, I reached a clearing on the side of the hill. The ground was covered in tall grass that swayed slightly in the breeze, and I could see the river far below, glinting through the trees. I sat down on a fallen log to eat something, keeping my eyes on the tree-line. The silence here was strange again, thick, unnatural. While I chewed, I thought I saw a shadow move between two trees on the far side of the clearing. It was gone in an instant, and I couldn't tell if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But I found myself eating faster than before. I didn't like the idea of staying still for too long. After lunch, I decided to keep going, but instead of following the trail further uphill, I took a smaller, less defined path that seemed to head toward the river. The ground here was soft, and my boots sank slightly into the damp soil. The air grew cooler as I descended, and the smell of water became stronger. But that faint sense of being watched came back, stronger than before. I could hear the occasional crack of a twig or rustle of leaves, and every time I stopped to listen, the forest went dead silent again. When I reached the river, it was narrower than it had looked from above, but the water moved quickly, churning over rocks. I crouched down to fill my bottle and felt that prickle on the back of my neck, the instinct that someone was behind me. I stood up slowly, turning my head without moving my feet, but the bank behind me was empty. The trees stood motionless, and the shadows between them were deep. I forced myself to turn back to the water, but I didn't stay long. I started following the river upstream, hoping it would eventually lead me back toward the main trail. The banks were slippery, and I had to step carefully on the wet rocks. I rounded a bend and froze. Across the river, maybe 20 feet away, there was something standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out details. It was partially hidden by shadows, but I could see the outline of a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing me. My heartbeat sped up. I opened my mouth to say something, then closed it again. Something about the way they stood, so still and silent, didn't feel right. I glanced down at the water for just a second, and when I looked back, they were gone. I didn't like the idea of staying by the river anymore, so I turned away from it and headed uphill through the trees. There was no trail now, just uneven forest floor, thick with fallen leaves and moss. I kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was matching my steps at a distance. The forest was dense, and I had to duck under branches and step over logs, but every so often I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a flash of movement, a darker shadow against the trees. It was never there when I turned my head. After what felt like an hour, I came to a rocky ridge. I climbed it slowly, using my hands for balance. From the top, I could see a stretch of forest rolling out below me, endless and unbroken. No sign of the trail, no sign of my car. The sun was lower now, and the light filtering through the trees had turned golden, but it was fading fast. I realized I had to find my way back soon, or I'd be stuck out here in the dark. I decided to head downhill again, angling in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. The slope was steep, and I had to dig my heels in to keep from sliding. Halfway down, I heard it clear, heavy footsteps behind me. Not the light scampering of an animal, but deliberate, human steps. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. My pulse was racing now, and I moved faster, not caring about the noise I made. The forest grew darker as the sun dropped behind the ridge. My eyes strained to make out the path ahead, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the creak of branches in the wind, the distant rush of the river. The footsteps behind me returned, closer this time. I didn't stop to look. I just kept going, weaving through the trees, my breath coming hard and fast. When I finally stumbled onto a stretch of ground that looked familiar, relief washed over me. I recognized a crooked tree I had passed earlier in the day. I followed the faint path back toward where I thought the car was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, just far enough behind to stay out of sight. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I kept moving until I broke out into the gravel parking area. My car was exactly where I had left it, the only vehicle there. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, catching my breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the empty lot, the tree-line beyond. Nothing moved. I started the engine and pulled out, the gravel crunching under my tires. As I drove away, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But the forest remained still, fading into the distance behind me. Even now, thinking about it, I don't know if I was followed the whole time, or if my mind was just working against me. But I remember the feeling, cold, constant, and unshakable, that I wasn't alone out there. And I don't think I ever will forget it. I woke up early that morning with no real plan, except to get out of the house. The air was heavy with late summer heat, the kind that sticks to your skin, even when the sun hasn't been up long. I decided to drive out toward the countryside, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could walk and clear my head. I took the old highway out of town, the one that wound between fields and patches of forest, barely used except by farm trucks and the occasional wanderer like me. After about an hour, I came across a dirt pull-off. It wasn't marked, but there was a thin trail that disappeared into a stretch of tall grass and trees beyond. I parked the car, grabbed my water bottle, and started walking. The trail wasn't maintained, and the weeds brushed against my legs as I moved forward. The sounds of the highway faded quickly until the only things I could hear were insects and the faint rustle of leaves in the hot, still air. The further I went, the thicker the trees became. The dirt path narrowed, weaving between trunks, and I had to step over fallen branches here and there. Every now and then, a shaft of sunlight broke through the canopy, lighting up the dust that drifted in the air. There was something calming about it. No one else around, no cars, no voices, just my footsteps and the steady rhythm of my breathing. After maybe 20 minutes, I noticed the ground sloping gently downward. The forest floor grew damper, and the smell of wet earth and moss filled the air. I followed the slope until it leveled out near a shallow stream. The water moved lazily, clear enough to see the pebbles on the bottom. I crouched down, splashed my face, and let the coolness linger on my skin. I stayed there for a while, just listening to the trickle of water. But eventually, I got the urge to keep moving. On the far side of the stream, the land rose sharply into a ridge. I could see the faint outline of a path winding upward. It looked challenging but not impossible, so I crossed the stream, my shoes slipping slightly on the slick stones. The climb was steeper than I thought. My calves started to burn, and I had to use my hands in some spots to steady myself. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing hard, my shirt damp with sweat. But the view was worth it, rolling forest in every direction, the tree lines stretching so far it blurred into a hazy green horizon. That's when I noticed something. On a ridge about 200 feet away, a figure was moving steadily from left to right. They weren't walking a path. I couldn't see any clear trail, just moving across the slope in a straight line. Their pace was steady, their posture upright, but they didn't turn their head or glance around. They kept going until they disappeared behind the ridge. I stood there for a moment, watching the empty space where they had been. Something about it didn't sit right. Out here, so far from any houses or roads, it seemed strange for someone to be walking like that alone. There was no sign of camping gear, no visible pack, nothing in their hands. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, maybe taking a shortcut. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, so I started back down the other side of the hill, wanting to circle back toward the stream. The air in the forest felt different now, warmer, heavier. The insects were still buzzing, but there was a faint stillness beneath it, like the background noise had thinned. As I walked, I kept glancing behind me. Every shifting shadow made my stomach tighten, though I never actually saw anything moving. I reached the stream again and decided to follow it deeper into the trees rather than head back. The water curved gently, and the banks grew narrower and muddier. I was thinking about how far I should go when I spotted a pile of dead branches and dry leaves ahead, perfect firewood if I needed it. I walked over and started picking through the pile, snapping sticks into manageable lengths. That's when I heard it, a deep, steady breathing behind me, not like an animal's snort or panting. This was heavier, slower, like the sound of someone catching their breath after walking. I froze, a stick still in my hand. My eyes shifted toward the trees without turning my head. Between the trunks, I thought I saw the faintest shift of movement, something tall, upright. The breathing grew softer, as if it were moving away, but I still couldn't make out a clear shape. My pulse pounded so hard in my ears it drowned out the smaller forest sounds. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, just listening. When the breathing faded, I dropped the sticks and started walking quickly back toward the main path. I didn't run, not yet, but every nerve in my body screamed to move faster. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning between the trees, half expecting to see that shape again. By the time I reached the slope near the pull-off, I was almost jogging. My breathing was shallow, and sweat dripped down my back. The car was still there, parked in the same spot, the metal shimmering in the heat. I didn't relax until I was inside, doors locked, hands gripping the steering wheel. I sat there for a while before starting the engine. The trees stood silent beyond the tall grass, nothing moving, no sign of anyone. If I hadn't heard the breathing, if I hadn't seen that faint movement, I could have convinced myself I imagined it. But the sound was too clear, too close. Someone had been there, standing just inside the trees, watching. On the drive back, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I didn't see a car following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished, like whoever it was hadn't been out there by accident. I thought about how far into the forest I had gone, how isolated it was. If I had been slower to notice, if I had kept collecting firewood a little longer, maybe I wouldn't have heard the breathing at all until it was too late. By the time I reached town, the sun was starting to dip. The streets felt busier than usual, full of noise and motion. But even there, in the middle of it, I couldn't stop thinking about the ridge, the figure, the sound behind me. I hadn't been followed home, but the memory followed me anyway, sharper than the heat of the day, impossible to shake. That night, when I closed my eyes, I didn't see the forest or the stream. I saw the space between the trees, where something had stood just far enough back to stay out of sight, waiting in the quiet, listening to me breathe. It had been one of those days where the air felt heavy from the start, thick and still, like the world was holding its breath. I had planned to take a long walk in the late afternoon, just to clear my head. There was a trail I often used that cut through the outer edges of a wooded area, stretching for miles before it eventually connected to another road on the far side. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it was quiet enough to make you feel far from anyone. I had always liked it for that reason. No traffic noise, no houses in sight, just the sound of my shoes on dirt and gravel, and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind bothered to move. By the time I reached the start of the trail, the sun was dipping low but still strong enough to paint everything in a dull orange glow. The shadows stretched longer than usual, making the trees look taller and the path narrower. The air smelled faintly of damp soil, like it had rained recently somewhere nearby, though the ground was dry. My footsteps sounded louder than normal, each one crunching against the gravel with a sharpness that seemed to echo. The first mile or so was uneventful. I passed the familiar curve where the trail dipped slightly before rising again, the place where water pooled after heavy rains. The grass on either side was tall, brushing against my legs if I strayed too close to the edge. I kept to the center, breathing evenly, feeling the rhythm of my movement settle into something almost mechanical. My mind began to drift. It wasn't until I reached the stretch where the trees closed in tighter that I noticed how quiet it had become. Even on calm days, there was usually some background noise, birds, distant cars, the hum of insects, but now there was nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the occasional scrape of my shoe on an uneven patch. I slowed my pace without realizing it, scanning the trees on either side. Somewhere to my left, far enough that I couldn't see it clearly, I heard a branch snap. It wasn't the kind of sound you get from a squirrel or bird. Too heavy, too deliberate. My head turned automatically. But the trees were dense enough that anything more than a few feet in was swallowed by shadow. I kept moving, telling myself it was probably a deer. There were plenty around here, and it wasn't unusual to hear them moving just out of sight. A few minutes later, another sound came, this time behind me. A soft, deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stopped completely and stood still, listening. The air seemed to press in on me, the silence almost humming in my ears. Nothing followed. After a few seconds, I told myself I was being paranoid and started walking again, faster this time. The trail eventually split into two paths, a narrow one that veered off into thicker woods and a wider one that stayed closer to open fields. I normally took the narrow one because it was more scenic, but now something about it felt unwelcoming. I stuck to the wider path. The light was fading quickly, the orange tones giving way to cooler, shadowy blues. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, my eyes scanning for movement. That's when I saw it, something shifting between the trees far behind me. At first, I thought it was just the play of shadows, but the shape was too solid, too steady. It was gone before I could focus, slipping out of sight like it had stepped backward into the dark. My chest tightened. I picked up my pace, the sound of my footsteps now sharp and urgent against the gravel. The path straightened out ahead, giving me a clear line of sight for a good 100 yards. I kept my eyes forward, forcing myself not to look back again. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own steps and the quickening beat of my heart. The sun had almost dropped below the treeline now, and the shadows felt heavier, pooling in every dip and hollow. When I reached the small wooden bridge that crossed over a shallow creek, I slowed again, partly from caution and partly from the need to listen. The water below trickled softly, a thin sound against the stillness. I stepped onto the bridge, the boards creaking under my weight. Halfway across, I heard it again, that same slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, this time much closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to just keep moving. I made it across the bridge and onto the dirt path again, my strides long and hurried. The trail curved left, and as soon as I rounded it, I broke into a jog. The air felt colder now, damp against my skin, and I realized my hands were clenched into fists. The last stretch before the trail ended was lined with tall grass and scattered bushes, open enough that I could see the road in the distance. I kept my eyes locked on that road, focusing on it like it was the only safe place left in the world. My breathing was heavy now, my chest tight from both the pace and the tension winding through me. I was maybe 50 yards from the end when I heard the sound again, off to my right, faster this time, like something moving parallel to me through the grass. The movement was low, fast, not the awkward bound of a deer. My pulse spiked. I forced my legs to move faster, pushing myself into a near sprint. The grass to my right shook as something cut through it, keeping pace with me. I didn't dare look, but I could feel the presence there, close enough that if I reached out, I might touch it. My mind raced with possibilities. Coyote, stray dog, even a person, but none of them felt right. Whatever it was moving too smoothly, too purposefully. I burst out onto the road, the open space feeling almost shocking after the enclosed pressure of the trail. My shoes hit the asphalt with a loud, solid sound. I didn't stop. I kept running, crossing to the other side before finally looking back. The trail mouth was empty. Just dark trees and tall grass swaying slightly in the wind that had suddenly picked up. My breathing was ragged, my skin damp with sweat despite the cool air. I stood there for a long moment, staring into that shadowed opening, half expecting something to emerge. Nothing did. The walk back to my car was slower, every step feeling heavy. The streetlights hadn't come on yet, and the dim light made everything look flat and unreal. My ears were still tuned for any sound, my body on edge even though I was now in open space. When I finally reached the car and shut the door, the quiet inside was almost too much. I sat there for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the trail entrance in the distance. I don't know what followed me that evening, or why it stopped when it did, but the memory of that movement, steady, deliberate, keeping pace with me, has stayed in my mind ever since. I haven't gone back to that trail. I don't think I ever will. The thought of stepping back into that silence, knowing what could be there, is enough to keep me away. The woods feel different to me now, not as empty as they once did, and I can't shake the sense that if I ever returned, it might not stop at just following. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains. I had been working nonstop for months, and my head felt crowded. I wanted silence. Not the kind of silence you get at night in the city, where there's still the distant hum of traffic or the occasional siren, but real silence. The kind you only get far away from people, where the air feels untouched and every sound is its own event. I packed light, just enough food for 3 days, a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, extra clothes, a map, and my knife. The weather had been calm for a week, and the forecast looked clear. I picked a spot I had seen on maps before, a small meadow surrounded by dense pine forest, with a stream cutting through the east side. It was at least an 8-mile hike in from the nearest trailhead. The hike in was quiet except for my own footsteps crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air was warm but not heavy, the kind of temperature that made walking steady and easy. My pack pressed into my shoulders, and every so often I would switch straps to give my arms a break. The trail wound upward, then flattened into long stretches between towering trees. Occasionally, sunlight broke through the canopy in sharp, golden patches. I didn't see anyone else the entire way. No footprints in the softer parts of the trail, no voices carrying through the air. Just me, the forest, and the sound of water somewhere ahead. When I finally reached the meadow, it looked even better than I imagined. The grass was knee-high in some places, bending gently when the breeze moved through. The stream ran clear over smooth stones, barely more than knee-deep in most parts, and its sound was soft enough to be soothing, but constant enough to remind you it was there. The tree line around the meadow was thick, like a wall, and beyond it the forest dropped into shadows even though the afternoon sun was still high. I picked a spot near the stream to set up camp, close enough to have water handy, but far enough to avoid the damp ground. By the time I had my tent up and gear organized, the sun was lowering toward the ridge. The light turned warmer, brushing the grass in gold. I ate a simple dinner and watched the sky shift colors. The quiet was exactly what I'd wanted. No hum of people, no engines, just the occasional bird and the trickle of water. When it was fully dark, the stars came out in numbers I never saw back home. They seemed to crowd the sky, and I stood there for a while, letting my eyes adjust until I could make out the faint band of the Milky Way overhead. The air cooled quickly, and I finally zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the sound of the stream lulling me to sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the air felt colder, and my breath made faint clouds in the beam of my headlamp when I clicked it on. I didn't hear anything at first, and I almost rolled back over, but then I caught it, a faint crunching sound. It wasn't close, but it was steady, and it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of weight on the ground. Something was moving at a slow, deliberate pace somewhere out beyond my tent. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk. The forest here had plenty of both. I stayed still, trying to listen without making any noise, but after a minute the sound faded, and I didn't hear it again. I eventually fell back asleep. The next day was calm. I spent the morning following the stream, moving into the trees a bit to see what was around. The air inside the forest felt different, cooler, heavier. The ground was softer underfoot, covered in pine needles, and the smell of resin from the trees was stronger here. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or two from camp, before turning back. I didn't see anything unusual, though I did notice an odd stillness deeper in, like fewer birds were singing. By afternoon, I had collected enough dry wood for a small fire that night, stacking it neatly by my tent. As the day faded again, I started to notice how quickly the light disappeared once it touched the treetops. One moment the meadow was bathed in warm evening sun, and the next it felt dim, as if someone had turned the light down. When I finally lit the fire, the small flames threw just enough light to push back the dark around my tent, but beyond that ring everything vanished into black. I cooked, ate, and sat listening to the fire crackle. The forest was quiet, too quiet for evening. No crickets, no frogs by the stream, no distant animal calls. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that maybe I had tuned it out the night before, and was only noticing now because I was alone with nothing else to focus on. That night, I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear slow crunching. I heard something sharper, like sticks snapping underfoot, and it was closer. My heart rate picked up immediately, but I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound came in short bursts, then silence, then again. It was moving in a curve, like something circling. I kept my knife close and listened for what felt like forever. Eventually, the noises moved further away, swallowed by the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I walked out toward the part of the meadow where I thought the sounds had been. The grass there was bent in places, but it was hard to tell if it was from an animal or just the wind. Then I noticed a spot where the ground had been pressed down in a shape that looked like a partial footprint, larger than mine, but not clear enough to make out details. I told myself it was probably an elk. They could wander through at night without much concern for a camp. The third day was supposed to be my last before hiking out. I spent most of it fishing in the stream and resting by the tent. By late afternoon, clouds had started to move in from the west, dark and low. I didn't like the idea of hiking out in a storm, so I decided I'd pack early in the morning and leave before it got bad. The air felt heavier that evening, and the wind had picked up slightly, moving through the grass in waves. I kept my fire smaller than the night before, partly because I didn't want sparks flying in the wind. When I finally settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself it was just nerves from the noises the night before, but my body stayed tense. Sometime after midnight, I woke again, but not from sound this time. It was the smell. A musky, sharp scent drifted into the tent, one I hadn't smelled before. It was strong enough to make me fully alert instantly. I listened, every muscle stiff, and then I heard it, a slow, steady breathing outside the tent. Not the wind, not the stream, breathing. It was close enough that I could hear the faint shift of grass with each inhale. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The breathing stayed there for what felt like minutes, then slowly began to move away, the sound of grass brushing underfoot fading into the distance. I lay there, barely blinking, until I was sure it was gone. I didn't sleep again. When first light came, I packed fast. I skipped breakfast, shoved everything into my pack, and started down the trail. The forest, so still before, now seemed alive with small noises, branches shifting, distant movement, but I didn't look for the sources. I kept my pace steady, resisting the urge to run. The clouds from the night before had thickened, and the light felt dim even in the morning. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I glanced back once. At the edge of the trees, far behind, I thought I saw a movement, a figure between the trunks. It was too far to make out clearly, and it didn't step forward. I didn't look again. I kept walking until I saw my car, the sight of it filling me with a relief I hadn't felt in years. I never went back to that meadow. Even now, when I think of it, I remember the way the grass moved that night, the sharp smell in the air, and the slow, deliberate breathing just outside my tent. I had gone there for silence, but what I found was a silence that felt watched. And that's a kind of quiet I never want to feel again. It had been a long week, and I needed to get away from everything. I decided to spend the weekend out in a quiet, isolated spot I had read about online. It wasn't a famous campsite, more of a small clearing near the edge of a thick forest. The place was about a 2-hour drive from town, and the last mile was nothing but a rough dirt road that forced me to go slow. By the time I got there, the sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. I parked near the clearing, stepped out, and just stood there for a minute, breathing in the smell of pine and damp soil. The air was cooler here than in the city, the kind of air that felt fresh even when you pulled it deep into your lungs. I could hear birds somewhere in the distance, their calls echoing faintly. No cars, no voices, no noise except for the forest. I set up my small tent near the tree line. The ground was a little uneven, and I had to clear away sticks and rocks before I could lay it flat. After I finished, I made a small fire pit using some stones nearby and gathered enough wood to keep it going through the night. The light faded quickly, and soon the forest was dark except for the glow from my fire. The night had a stillness that was almost too still. The wind barely moved the branches. Every sound seemed sharp, the crackle of the fire, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out in the dark. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and sat watching the fire die down to glowing embers. By then, the moon was rising, silver light spilling through the trees, but it only lit the tops. Below, the forest stayed in shadow. I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. I stayed near the edge of the clearing, not going too deep into the woods. The ground was soft in some spots and firm in others, and I had to watch my footing. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the leaves about 30 feet away. I stopped and listened, but it went silent, probably just an animal. I turned back toward the camp and stoked the fire before sitting for a while longer. When I finally decided to sleep, I zipped up the tent, lay down in my sleeping bag, and listened to the quiet. For a while, all I heard was my own breathing and the faint hiss of cooling embers outside. Then there was a sound, faint but clear, of something moving in the clearing. It wasn't fast. It was slow, steady, like cautious steps on dirt. My first thought was that it might be a deer. I held still, listening hard. The steps stopped for a moment, then shifted to the side, circling. My skin prickled, and I told myself not to panic. The sound moved away after a while, fading into the woods. I stayed awake for a long time, just in case. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cold, and my breath fogged in front of me. I noticed something in the dirt about 10 feet from the tent, footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were shoe prints, and they weren't mine. The ground had been damp the day before, so the impressions were clear. They circled the tent, stopping at different points, as if whoever made them had paused to look inside. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't just someone passing through. Whoever it was had walked right up to my camp while I was sleeping. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. I made coffee and forced myself to eat breakfast, though my appetite was gone. The plan had been to stay until Sunday, but now I wasn't sure. I told myself I would see how the rest of the day went. I spent the morning gathering more firewood, keeping my ears open for any unusual sounds. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I bent down, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. The trees seemed thicker than before, the shadows darker. By afternoon, clouds rolled in, and the air grew heavy. I decided to take a short hike down a narrow trail I had spotted earlier. The path was overgrown in some spots, with roots sticking up like ropes across the dirt. After about 20 minutes, I reached a ridge that overlooked a dry creek bed. I stood there for a moment, taking in the view. That's when I noticed movement below, a figure walking along the creek bed, maybe 200 feet away. The person was dressed in dark clothing, moving at a steady pace, not looking around. Something about the way they walked, head down, arms swinging slightly, made me uneasy. They didn't seem to be carrying anything, no backpack, nothing that would suggest they were out hiking or camping. I crouched down, watching them until they disappeared around a bend. My first thought was to head back to camp, but I decided to wait a few minutes. just in case they were coming this way. When nothing happened, I made my way back, moving faster than before. By the time I reached my tent, the light was fading. I built the fire up higher than the night before, its heat and glow giving me some comfort. I sat there until late, listening. The forest was quiet again, but in a way that felt unnatural, like everything was holding its breath. I didn't want to sleep, but I had to. I zipped the tent up tight and lay there in the dark, every sound amplified in my mind. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and it was still dark. I could hear it again, those slow, deliberate steps outside. They came from one side, stopped, then started again from another. I lay completely still, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The steps moved closer, stopping just feet from where my head was. I could hear the faint sound of breathing now. Steady, human. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like minutes, then moved away slowly. I didn't sleep again. I waited until the first hint of dawn, packed up my things as quietly as I could, and loaded them into the car. The whole time, I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. As I drove away, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me go. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the road turned, and the clearing was gone from sight. The relief I felt when I reached the main road was almost overwhelming. The forest was behind me, but the image of that figure stayed in my mind, and so did the memory of those footsteps circling my tent in the dark. I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to head out for a hike. I had been staying in a small cabin that belonged to a friend, tucked away deep in the hills where the roads were narrow and the air smelled like pine. The plan wasn't anything big, just a few hours out, follow a trail I had seen from the dirt road, maybe sit by the creek for a while, and come back before dark. The weather was cool, the sun still up but already dipping low enough to throw long shadows between the trees. I had a small backpack with a bottle of water, a granola bar, and my phone, though I knew service here was spotty. The trail wasn't marked, just a faint path where others must have walked before. The ground was soft, covered with fallen pine needles that muffled each step. The forest was dense in some places and open in others, with sunlight spilling through in strips and patches. I walked at an easy pace at first, enjoying the quiet. The air felt still, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird's distant call. After about 40 minutes, I reached a spot where the trees opened into a small clearing. There was an old tree stump in the middle, its surface rough and weathered. I sat for a minute, drank some water, and looked around. The ground sloped down on the far side, leading toward the creek I was aiming for. It was faint in the distance, just a shimmer of light between the branches where water caught the sun. I followed the slope down, stepping over exposed roots and ducking under low branches. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, and soon I could hear the steady trickle of the creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones and fallen twigs. I crouched down, ran my fingers through it, and sat on a rock nearby. It was peaceful, just the sound of the water and the wind moving through the upper branches. I stayed there for maybe 15 minutes, enough time for my mind to wander, before I stood and decided to head back. The trail back up the slope felt slightly different. The light had shifted, and shadows were longer, darker, stretching across the path like black stripes. I moved steadily, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest wasn't as easy to read now. There were no markers, no signs, just trees that all looked similar. At first I thought nothing of it, but after about 10 minutes I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The slope felt unfamiliar. The trees here were thicker, closer together, and the ground was uneven with more rocks and fallen branches. I stopped, looked around, and tried to recall the exact way I had come. There was a patch of brambles I didn't remember seeing before, and when I turned, the creek was no longer visible. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but it wouldn't load. The signal bar flickered once and went blank. I took a breath and told myself to keep calm. I decided to keep moving in the direction I thought was right, figuring I would eventually intersect the original trail. The air felt cooler now, and as I walked, I noticed how quickly the light was fading. In the forest, the sun seemed to drop faster, the shadows deepening until it felt like early evening. The quiet I had enjoyed earlier now felt heavy. Even the wind had died down. I started hearing small sounds, twigs snapping somewhere behind me, a faint crunch of leaves. At first I thought it was just a squirrel or some small animal, but after a few minutes, I realized it was happening too regularly, almost in rhythm with my own steps. I would walk, hear a snap behind me, stop, and hear nothing. Then I'd start again, and after a short delay, another faint sound would follow. I didn't turn around right away. I just kept walking, my heart picking up speed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But after a while, curiosity and unease made me glance back. The trees stood still, nothing moved. No one there. I tried to move faster now, my eyes scanning the ground for anything familiar. The terrain shifted again, the ground dipped slightly, and I found myself stepping into a narrow gully. The sides were steep enough that I could see less of the forest around me. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. A heavy step, not like the light, quick movement of an animal. It was slow, deliberate, almost measured. I didn't like the idea of being in a low spot, so I climbed the side of the gully, grabbing onto roots and rocks to pull myself up. My breathing was louder than I wanted it to be. Once I reached the top, I stopped to listen. Everything was still. I couldn't even hear a bird. The air felt colder now, enough that I zipped my jacket up. I took another look at my phone. Still no service, and the battery was already at 42%. I stuffed it back in my pocket and kept moving. My mind kept going over possibilities. A hiker? A hunter? Someone just out here by chance. The idea of a wild animal was possible, but the steps had been too heavy. After maybe another 20 minutes of walking, I realized I wasn't going to find the trail before dark. The forest had turned dim, with only a faint glow left in the sky. I decided to head toward higher ground, thinking I might spot the road from there. The climb was slow, the hill steep and covered in loose soil that slipped under my boots. Halfway up, I froze. The sound came again, this time directly behind me, closer than before. It wasn't just a step. It was followed by the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, almost calm. My own breathing became quick and shallow, but I didn't turn around. Instead, I pushed myself up the hill as quickly as I could, using my hands to grip anything solid. When I reached the top, I finally looked back. Nothing. Just dark shapes of trees against the fading light. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my hands, then turned and started moving again, forcing myself to focus on getting out. The trees thinned a little at the top, and I could see a stretch of land sloping down on the other side. I thought I saw a faint break in the tree line far off, which could have been the road. I headed that way, not caring about the noise I made. The light was almost gone now, and the cold was sinking into my fingers. I had just started down the slope when I heard it again, not behind me this time, but to my left, close, too close. It was followed by a rustle of leaves and a single, deliberate step. My chest tightened. I kept moving, faster now, glancing sideways but never stopping. The trees blurred in my peripheral vision as I half walked, half ran downhill. At the bottom of the slope, I finally saw it, the dirt road, maybe 100 feet ahead. Relief hit me hard, and I pushed through the last stretch, stumbling over roots. I didn't stop until my boots hit the road. I turned, looking into the tree line. It was too dark now to see far, but I thought I caught the faintest hint of movement before it vanished into the black. I walked fast the rest of the way back to the cabin, my legs burning, my throat dry. When I finally reached the porch, I didn't look back again. I locked the door and sat by the window for hours, staring out at the dark tree line, wondering what had been pacing me out there and how long it had been watching. If I had left the creek just 10 minutes later, I think I wouldn't have made it back before the forest was completely dark. And if that had happened, I'm not sure I would have found the road at all. The thought still keeps me awake sometimes. It had been one of those days where everything felt slow and dull, and I just needed to get out for a bit. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving a pale blue haze across the sky, and the air was cooling fast. I had been driving home from work when I decided to take a back road I hadn't been down in years. It was one of those narrow country roads with faded asphalt, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other. Trees leaned in over both sides, their branches tangling above like skeletal fingers. I hadn't planned anything. No particular destination, just a quiet drive with the windows down, the sound of tires humming against the road. After a few miles, the trees opened up to a small gravel turnout, and I remembered there used to be a trailhead there. I had hiked it a long time ago, maybe 8 or 9 years back. It wasn't a popular spot. Too far from town, no signs, no amenities, just a dirt path disappearing into thick woods. I parked the car, killed the engine, and stepped out. The quiet hit me instantly. Out here, you could hear every small sound, wind moving through leaves, the distant creak of tree trunks shifting, the occasional call of a bird somewhere far off. My shoes crunched over the gravel as I walked toward the trail, feeling that faint chill that always comes in the early evening. The path was narrow, uneven, and covered in dry leaves. I remembered how it wound for a mile or two before hitting a small clearing with a view of the valley. That was my plan, to walk to that spot, maybe sit for a bit, then head back before dark. As I went deeper, the sound of the road behind me faded. The trees grew denser, crowding in close enough that the canopy blocked out most of the remaining light. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. I kicked a fallen branch aside and kept going, my footsteps loud in the silence. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something strange. There were no bird calls anymore. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own feet and the wind in the treetops. It wasn't unusual for the woods to get quiet, but this silence felt different. It felt heavy, like the air was pressing in on me. I slowed down, listening harder. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something behind me, just a single, crisp crack of a twig. I stopped. My eyes scanned the trees, but all I saw was shadow and tangled branches. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon, and I kept walking. But now I was aware of every sound my feet made, and I started glancing back more often. The trail twisted, and with each turn, I felt a growing urge to keep moving faster. When I reached the clearing, the last of the daylight was fading, leaving the sky a pale silver over the valley. Normally, I loved this view, hills rolling away into the distance, the faint outlines of farms far below. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't linger. That's when I heard it again. Not a twig this time, but the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the path I had just come from. They weren't close yet, but they were steady. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. I crouched slightly, my eyes fixed on the dark gap in the trees where the trail emerged into the clearing. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. A minute passed, maybe two. Then I heard the sound again, only now it was quieter, like whoever, or whatever, was trying to move without being heard. I knew then that it wasn't an animal. Animals don't pace themselves like that. Animals don't stop and start like they're watching you. I started backing up toward the other side of the clearing. There was no second trail, but the woods weren't impossible to move through if I needed to. My mind was running through options. Stay still and hope they leave, call out, or try to make it back to the car as quickly as possible. Then, through the shadows at the edge of the trees, I saw it, just a faint movement. Not a full figure, just the brief shift of something tall and upright moving behind the cover of a tree. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned and walked fast toward the opposite side of the clearing, where the tree line wasn't as dense. Branches snapped under my shoes as I pushed into the underbrush. The dry leaves made it impossible to move quietly, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed distance. I could still hear the other footsteps. They were faster now, less careful. Twigs breaking, leaves crunching. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. My legs were burning, my lungs tight, but I kept moving, forcing my way through small saplings and ducking under low branches. The forest felt endless, but I knew the road had to be somewhere ahead if I kept moving straight. Then I made the mistake of looking back. Through the tangle of branches, I saw a shape. Tall, thin. I couldn't make out details, but it was definitely a person. And they were following me directly, weaving through the trees without hesitation, like they'd done this before. I didn't look again. I just pushed harder, stumbling over a half-buried log and nearly going down. My shirt snagged on a thorn bush, ripping at the sleeve, but I tore free. My legs felt like they could give out any second. Finally, I caught the faint glint of something through the trees, metal. A guardrail. The road. I burst out of the tree line, my shoes hitting gravel. My car was still where I'd left it, the empty turnout stretching out in both directions. My keys were already in my hand, and I didn't look back until I was inside with the doors locked. The trees stood still and dark. Nothing moved. No one came out. I started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the key. As I pulled away, my headlights swept across the trail entrance for just a moment. And in that moment, I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was back in town, the streetlights breaking the darkness. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors the whole way home. That night, I locked every door and window. But sleep didn't come easily. The image of that figure at the edge of the trees burned into my mind. They hadn't run. They hadn't chased me once I reached the road. They had just stood there, as if they knew there was nothing I could do to make them leave my thoughts. And the worst part was knowing that trail was still there. Still empty. Still quiet. Waiting. It started late in the afternoon, just before the light began to thin. The air had that heavy late summer feeling, still warm, but with a faint coolness slipping in, reminding me that night wasn't far. I had been walking along a narrow, barely used trail that cut through a stretch of woods about 10 miles from town. I'd been here before in daylight, but never stayed late, never stayed long enough to hear the forest change its tone when the sun went down. The trail was uneven, roots crossing in every direction. Dry leaves clung to my shoes, crunching under every step. On both sides, the trees rose close together, tall and thin, their branches tangling into a loose canopy that blocked out most of the sky. Patches of dim light slipped through the gaps, falling on the forest floor in broken shapes. The deeper I went, the less I could see the horizon. It felt like I'd stepped into a space where time slowed down, where the rest of the world was far behind me. The further in I went, the quieter it got. Even the occasional bird call began to fade until I was left with only the sound of my footsteps. I could feel the sweat starting to dry on my skin, the air cooling just enough to make the dampness uncomfortable. A light wind moved through, barely strong enough to rustle the leaves above, but it carried a faint smell of damp soil, wood, and something else, something sharp, like the tang of rust. I stopped once to take a drink from my bottle and noticed how still everything was. Not just quiet, but still, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I couldn't see the trail ahead clearly anymore. It had grown thinner, the dirt path narrowing and fading under a layer of leaves and twigs. I remembered there was an old stream somewhere deeper in, and I thought maybe I'd head toward it before turning back. As I walked, I began noticing small details that didn't feel right. A broken branch hanging lower than it should, as if it had been snapped recently. The way the dirt was disturbed in certain spots, almost like shallow drag marks. A section of moss scraped clean from a fallen log, as though something heavy had slid across it. It wasn't enough to raise full alarm, but enough to make me slow down, to keep scanning the shadows ahead. The light was dimming fast now, the colors shifting from golden to gray. The air cooled more noticeably, and the shadows thickened. I could feel the first traces of that familiar unease. Nothing I could explain, just a tightening in my chest and the growing urge to turn around. I kept walking, but slower, every step quieter, more deliberate. That was when I heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the wind. A single, soft sound from somewhere ahead and to the left. It wasn't an animal cry, not quite. It was more like the sound of something heavy shifting its weight on the forest floor, leaves crunching under slow, deliberate pressure. I froze, every muscle tensing, my ears straining. For a moment, nothing. Then another step, heavier this time. The sound wasn't rushing toward me or moving away. It was steady, slow, unhurried. My eyes scanned the space between the trees, but there was nothing clear, only shapes in the dim light. The wind picked up slightly, making the leaves flutter, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just a deer. But then I realized something was different. A deer would move lightly, in short bursts, pausing, darting. This was heavier, spaced evenly like a person walking. I couldn't see far enough ahead to know for sure, and my stomach tightened at the thought of someone else being this deep in the woods without me knowing it. I stepped off the trail slightly, pressing myself between two thick trunks, my feet sinking slightly into the damp layer of leaves and soil. The sound continued, coming from somewhere just beyond a line of brush. I could almost picture the shape of something tall moving slowly, but I couldn't make out any details. I held my breath without realizing it, my ears catching every crunch of leaves, every shift of weight. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stayed frozen, counting the seconds in my head. 10 seconds. 15. 20. I didn't move. My heart was beating hard enough to feel in my neck. Somewhere in that silence, a faint sound came from behind me. A different direction entirely. It was softer this time, like a careful step, and it came from much closer. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dim space between the trees, but again nothing. The shadows seemed thicker now, stretching longer as the last light drained from the sky. I felt the air shift slightly, a faint breeze on the back of my neck that shouldn't have been there. It made me move. I stepped back toward the trail, my feet crunching louder than I wanted them to. My pace quickened, and the urge to get back to where the trees thinned out became all I could think about. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, and every time I did, I swore I caught the faintest flicker of movement far behind me. A shape too tall to be a deer, too steady to be the wind. I didn't let myself slow down. My breathing grew shallow, and my body felt tense all over. The trail seemed longer now, the familiar markers I remembered from earlier nowhere in sight. The sounds began again, keeping pace with me, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see clearly. The crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the kind of sounds that matched my own movements almost too closely. My legs burned as I pushed myself faster, my eyes darting constantly to the sides and back. When the first sign of the tree line appeared ahead, just a faint thinning of the darkness, I felt a wave of relief push through the fear. I moved quicker, almost running now, but the sounds behind me matched the change. They grew faster, heavier, more certain. I broke into a full run, my breath ragged, my arms pumping. The trees began to thin, patches of pale sky appearing between them. I didn't dare look back now, didn't want to see what might be there. The ground felt uneven under my feet, roots catching at my shoes, but I pushed forward. When I finally burst out of the tree line into the open clearing near the road, I didn't stop. I kept moving until I was well out into the open, away from the shadows. Only then did I turn, my chest heaving, my eyes locked on the dark wall of trees I had just come from. Nothing moved. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting for some sign of what had been behind me. The forest looked calm again, quiet, as though nothing had happened. But deep down I knew it wasn't empty. Something had been there, keeping pace with me, watching me without a sound until it decided to move. Even as I walked away, back toward the road and the faint glow of distant streetlights, I kept looking over my shoulder. I could still feel the weight of eyes on me, the memory of footsteps that matched my own. That night, lying in bed, the sound of crunching leaves wouldn't leave my head. It was steady, slow, unhurried, the sound of something that had no reason to rush. Something that knew exactly where I was and exactly how far I could run before the trees ended. And in that dark, quiet space of my room, I realized I had no idea how long it had been following me. It could have started long before I ever heard it, long before I even thought to look behind me. It could have been there from the moment I stepped into the woods. It had been a long week at work, and I needed to get out of the city. My head felt like it was in a constant hum from the noise of traffic, screens, and people talking over each other. I had no interest in going to a crowded place or a tourist spot. I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I wouldn't hear anything but the wind. I thought about a small lake I had seen once while driving through a rural area. The road that led to it was rough and narrow, barely more than a track, and it wound through thick woods until it reached an open clearing with water in the middle. I remembered thinking that it would be a perfect place to camp if I ever wanted to be alone. That Saturday, I threw my gear in the back of my car, tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with food, and some basic camping supplies. I didn't even bother telling anyone where I was going. I wanted to completely disappear for a night or two. The drive was long and slow. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and eventually to that uneven track. My tires crunched over rocks and dipped into ruts filled with muddy water. The trees on either side leaned in, blocking most of the light, so that even though it was mid-afternoon, the road ahead looked dim. When I finally reached the clearing, it felt exactly as I remembered, silent except for the faint sound of water lapping against the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves. The lake was calm, with the sunlight reflecting off it in a glare that made me squint. Tall grass grew along the edges, and there were no signs of other campers or even any human activity. I set up my tent about 30 feet from the water, just close enough to hear it at night. I spent the rest of the afternoon collecting small branches for a fire. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots sank a little with each step. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I walked around the edge of the lake for a while, just taking in the stillness. A few dragonflies hovered over the surface, and now and then I'd see the ripple of a fish breaking the water. The trees around the lake were dense, and beyond them, the forest looked almost black. There was something about those shadows that made me glance over my shoulder more than once, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to such complete quiet. By evening, I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal and sat watching the sky fade from pale blue to orange to deep purple. As darkness settled in, the lake turned almost mirror-like, reflecting the stars. The air cooled quickly, and the firelight became my only comfort against the surrounding blackness. I heard the occasional splash from the lake, but otherwise it was silent. Too silent, in a way. Even at night, I expected to hear insects, maybe a frog or two, but it was as if the forest was holding its breath. Around 9, I decided to take a short walk with my flashlight. I followed a narrow path that led into the trees, just to stretch my legs before turning in. The beam from my light cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of the trees and the occasional glint of moisture on leaves. I didn't go far, maybe 100 feet, before I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the sound of twigs snapping, somewhere deeper in the woods. I stood still listening. The sound came again, then stopped. I told myself it could be a deer. This was their territory, after all. But there was something about the rhythm of the steps that didn't feel like an animal's random movement. They were steady, deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing slowly. I stayed there for another minute, my flashlight aimed in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Eventually, I turned and went back to my camp. The unease stayed with me, though. When I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. The fabric walls of the tent felt too thin, too flimsy. Every sound outside seemed louder in the dark. I lay there, listening to the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, until I finally drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, and the inside of the tent was completely dark. At first, I thought it was just the quiet that woke me, but then I heard it, footsteps again. Slow, crunching in the grass. They were close, too close. I held my breath and strained to hear. The steps circled around my tent, pausing every so often, as if whoever, or whatever, it was listening for something inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might be loud enough to give me away. Then the sound stopped. I lay there frozen for what felt like several minutes, afraid to move. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, there was another noise. Not footsteps this time, but the sound of something brushing against the tent wall, just inches from my head. The fabric shifted slightly inward, like a hand pressing on it. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. The pressure disappeared, and I heard the steps again, moving away this time, toward the water. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up with my back against my pack, flashlight in hand. I didn't hear anything else until the faint light of dawn started to seep through the tent walls. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was damp with dew, and there were footprints in the grass. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, barefoot, from the look of them. The prints led from the tree-line to my tent, circled it, and then went toward the lake. I followed them slowly, every nerve in my body tense. The prints went right to the edge of the water and stopped. I scanned the surface, but it was calm, as if nothing had disturbed it. The woods behind me were silent, but that silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something watching and waiting. I packed up quickly, barely taking the time to fold my tent. My hands shook as I shoved everything into the car. As I drove out, the narrow track seemed even darker than before, the trees crowding in on both sides. Every shadow between them looked like it could hide someone. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I realize how tense my shoulders had been, how tightly I'd been gripping the wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. There was never anyone there, but the feeling didn't go away. Even when I was miles from the lake, I felt it, that quiet, steady presence just out of sight. Later, when I thought about the footprints, I realized something that made my skin crawl all over again. The ground was soft, and I had left my own prints near the tent when I went for my evening walk. But the ones I'd seen in the morning were deeper, heavier, and they overlapped mine in places. Whoever had been there had been walking in my steps, following exactly where I had gone. That night, safe in my own bed, the silence of my apartment should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Every creak of the building, every faint sound from outside, felt sharper now, more deliberate. I kept thinking about that moment in the tent when the wall had pressed inward, about the weight of it, the stillness before it moved away. I didn't go camping again after that. Not alone. Not anywhere near a place where you can't tell if the quiet is just the woods being still, or if it's someone waiting for you to let your guard down. I had been driving since early morning, trying to make it to my cousin's place before nightfall. The road cut through long stretches of farmland, occasional patches of forest, and small towns that felt almost abandoned. The air had been warm during the day, but as the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped, and a damp chill settled in. I was still about 2 hours away when I saw a small gas station on the side of the road. The sign above it was old, the paint fading, but I decided to stop and stretch my legs before continuing. The gas station was one of those lonely places with a single pump, a flickering overhead light, and a store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and old wood mixed together. I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, paid in cash, and stepped back outside. The air felt heavier now, with the last bits of daylight slipping away. I got back in my car and kept driving, watching the landscape flatten out, the fields stretching so far they seemed to meet the horizon. The 2-lane road ahead of me wound slightly, and then straightened for long, empty stretches. I noticed how few cars passed by, maybe one every 20 minutes. After a while, the road narrowed, and dense woods replaced the open fields. The trees leaned over the road, their branches tangled like a net, making the fading light dim even faster. By the time I reached the midpoint of that wooded stretch, it was almost fully dark. My headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the blackness, and the beams bounced off trunks and low branches. The road was smooth at first, but then I hit a rough patch, the kind where the asphalt breaks up into jagged edges and gravel. I slowed down, feeling the crunch under my tires. That's when I saw something just ahead, what looked like a dark shape lying across part of the road. At first, I thought it might be a fallen branch, but as I got closer, I saw it was too big and too oddly shaped for that. I slowed more, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. It was an animal, a deer maybe, lying on its side. My headlights lit up its legs, twisted at angles that didn't seem right. Its chest rose and fell shallowly, meaning it was still alive. I stopped the car about 10 feet away. The deer's head lifted slightly, and I caught the reflection of its eyes for just a moment. But then, from the darkness beyond the trees, I heard something else, a faint crunch of leaves. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. My instinct told me to just drive around the deer, but the way it was lying made that impossible without going off the road. The noise in the trees stopped. I sat there, staring into the blackness between the trunks, waiting for something to move. My heart was pounding, and I could feel that prickly sensation in my skin that comes when your body is screaming that something isn't right. I rolled forward slightly, thinking maybe I could nudge the deer enough to pass. But just as I eased forward, there was another sound from the woods, a single, heavy footstep. Not the quick scurry of an animal. Slow, measured. I stopped again. My headlights caught brief flashes of something pale between the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but I knew it wasn't another deer. It stood still for a long moment, and then it moved, stepping deeper into the shadows. I didn't like the feeling in my stomach. I backed the car up, the tires crunching on gravel, then turned sharply and went off onto the narrow shoulder. The edge dropped off into weeds and underbrush, and my car tilted slightly as I maneuvered past the deer. As soon as I cleared it, I pressed on the gas and drove until the woods thinned and I reached an open stretch again. I kept glancing in my mirrors, expecting to see something step out into the road behind me, but there was nothing except the empty asphalt disappearing into darkness. About 10 minutes later, I noticed my gas gauge was lower than I thought it would be. That stop at the station earlier had been quick, and I'd only gotten enough to make it comfortably to my cousin's, but the detour around the deer had eaten up more fuel than I'd planned. I pulled over briefly to check my map, and saw there was a small town about 6 miles ahead. It wasn't much, but it had a gas station marked. When I got there, the place was dimly lit and completely deserted. The pump had an old analog meter and a faded sign saying it was self-serve, cash only. I filled the tank and stood there for a moment listening. The night air was so quiet it felt unnatural. No crickets, no wind through the trees, just silence. I got back in my car and drove on. The road out of that town curved back into more wooded areas, but this time the trees were thinner. I felt a little more at ease until I saw something up ahead again. Two small points of light reflecting back at me from the side of the road. They were low to the ground, probably an animal's eyes, I thought. As I got closer, the eyes vanished, and I caught a glimpse of movement as something darted into the underbrush. I drove past, trying not to focus on it too much. About half an hour later, I finally pulled onto the long rural driveway leading to my cousin's property. The driveway itself was lined with trees, their branches reaching high enough not to block the view of the sky. The house came into sight, lights glowing warmly in the windows. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. A single fresh set of muddy footprints leading up the gravel drive, veering slightly into the grass, and then disappearing into the tree line to the right of the house. I slowed down again, staring at those tracks. They were human, barefoot. The ground was damp from an earlier drizzle, and the prints looked recent, the edges still crisp. They were spaced in a way that suggested the person wasn't running, but walking steadily. I stopped the car in front of the house and looked toward the trees, but the darkness there was thick, hiding everything beyond the first few feet. A faint unease crept back in, the same kind I'd felt back on the road with the deer. I sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to listen for anything. The night was still quiet, but that silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was holding its breath. I got my bags from the car quickly and went inside. My cousin wasn't home yet. He had mentioned earlier he might be late from work, but the house felt too still. I checked the locks twice, then went to the front window and peered out. The gravel driveway was empty, but I could just make out the faint outline of those footprints still pressed into the grass. For the rest of the night, I kept the lights on and stayed near the windows listening. Every so often, I thought I heard faint movements outside, a branch bending, leaves shifting, but it was too irregular to be the wind. I didn't sleep until I heard my cousin's car pull in sometime past midnight. The next morning, I went outside. The footprints were still there, but now there was something else. A second set. These were much fainter, as if whoever made them had been standing in one place for a while, right near the edge of the trees, just facing the house. And I knew, without wanting to admit it, that whoever had been out there on that road the night before had somehow made their way here.